Imagine moving into a beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood, thinking you have finally found the perfect place to start the next chapter of your life, only to discover that the walls themselves are keeping secrets that will make your blood run cold. Back in the summer of 2023, I lived through one of the most terrifying weekends of my life. Even now, thinking about it makes my skin crawl. I have never been the kind of person who enjoys being home alone. I have always felt a little jumpy when the house gets too quiet, but after what happened during those few days, I can honestly say I have not stayed overnight anywhere by myself ever again. It completely changed how I feel about being alone in the dark. At the time, my fiancé, Ryan, and I were looking to buy our very first house. Our lease on our apartment was just about to expire, and we really did not want to sign another full-year lease. We were ready for a real home. It turned out that my dad had an old friend who owned a house in the area. This house was suddenly sitting vacant and was available to rent. The previous tenants had recently passed away. Because my dad was so incredibly close with the owner agreed to let us move in and rent it from him month to month for a very cheap rate. He told us we could stay there for as long as we needed while we looked for a house to buy. This was a massive relief for us. It took away so much of the stress of house hunting. But for me, there was one major downside. I was not thrilled at all about moving into a house where both of the previous residents had just died inside the home within a few weeks of each other. They were elderly, so it was not like there was some kind of violent crime or anything like that. But still, just knowing that two people had recently died in the very rooms where I was going to sleep gave me a really bad feeling. Ryan, on the other hand, was not bothered by it at all. He was just incredibly excited about the cheap rent. He is the kind of guy who does not believe in things like bad energy or ghosts, but I absolutely do. When we first moved in, he would constantly tease me about being scared. He would even make fake ghost noises when we were walking through the dark hallways just to mess with me. I know that makes him sound like a bit of a jerk, but he really is a wonderful guy. He just likes to joke around and push my buttons. Usually, I would just roll my eyes and tell him to shut up, and we would laugh about it. But when we first stepped inside the house, it was hard to feel comfortable. The entire place was covered in this horrible, ugly tan carpet. My dad's friend told us that he was already planning on having someone come over to tear all the carpet out and replace it with nice hardwood floors. He explained that the carpet was not only ugly, but it was also covered in stains. In the middle of the living room, there was one particularly large, dark stain on the carpet that really stood out. On our very first day in the house, Ryan asked my dad's friend if he knew what had caused that specific stain. That was when he shared some information that I really wish I had never heard. He told us that the elderly woman who lived there had suffered a terrible fall. She had tripped and hit her head very hard on an end table in the living room. The large stain on the carpet was from her blood. She was rushed to the hospital that night, but unfortunately she never recovered and passed away. Then, he went on to tell us about her husband. He had passed away just a few weeks before her fall. He had suffered a massive heart attack while he was down in the basement. Hearing all of this made me feel absolutely sick. I was horrified at the thought of living in this house, even if it was only going to be temporary. But at the same time, we had to be practical. We needed to save money for our own house, and this was by far the most cost-efficient option for us. We just had to make it work. We had only been living in the house for about 2 days when the workers arrived to tear up the ugly tan carpets. I cannot even begin to tell you how happy I was to see that stained carpet go. The owner also hired someone to paint the entire interior of the house. It is amazing how much a fresh coat of paint and some new floors can change the vibe of a place. It suddenly felt clean, bright, and much more like a normal home. I started to settle in and feel a little more relaxed. It also helped that the owner had installed a modern home security system. It was one of those systems that announces whenever a door is opened. Every time you opened the front or back door, a loud automated voice would ring through the house saying, "Front door open," or "Back door open." It actually got annoying very quickly, but even though it was tedious to hear all day, it did give me a real sense of security. I knew that nobody could open a door without the entire house knowing about it. About a month went by, and we were getting used to the place. Then the weekend arrived when Ryan had to leave town. It was his bachelor party weekend, and he was heading out with his friends. I was definitely feeling a little anxious about being completely alone in the house for 2 nights, but I kept telling myself that I was being silly. The house felt like our home now. Plus, I was not totally alone. I had our Australian cattle dog, Rex, with me. Rex was a great dog and he made me feel incredibly safe. He was very loyal and protective. On Friday, July 7th, I woke up early and got ready for work. I left the house around 7 in the morning. Before I left, I kissed Ryan goodbye because he was leaving for his trip a few hours later. He was not going to be back until late Sunday afternoon. I went to work, did my shift, and headed back home that evening. As soon as I walked through the door, I felt this strange, uneasy sensation. It was like a heavy feeling in the air. I tried to shake it off. I told myself that I was just letting my own anxiety get the best of me because I knew Ryan was gone. To comfort myself, I decided to order some Thai food. Ryan absolutely hates Thai food, so I rarely get to eat it. I figured this was the perfect opportunity to treat myself. I sat on the couch, ate my food, and turned on my favorite show, The Office. I just wanted to lose myself in a funny, familiar show and relax. By the time midnight rolled around, I was starting to get really tired. I turned off the television, and the house suddenly became dead silent. That was when I heard it. It was a strange, subtle noise coming from the basement. It sounded like something was moving down there. This was an older house, so I tried to convince myself that it was just the wood framing creaking as the temperature cooled down at night. I stood up and started walking toward the bedroom, but then Rex suddenly sprinted across the living room. He ran straight to the basement door and stood there, staring at it. Then he started to bark. This was completely out of character for Rex. He was a very quiet dog. He almost never barked. Usually, if he wanted to make noise, he would just let out a low howl, but on this night he was barking aggressively at the basement door. He sounded incredibly tense, like he was sensing some kind of immediate danger. I walked over to him and tried to pet him to calm him down, but he would not budge. His entire body was stiff. I do not know what came over me, but I slowly reached out and opened the basement door. I reached inside and flipped the light switch on. The moment the light went on, Rex stopped barking, but he immediately started to growl. It was a deep, menacing growl. I took a step forward, thinking that maybe I should just go down the stairs and make sure everything was okay. But then I remembered. This was the basement where the old man had suffered his fatal heart attack. I know it sounds ridiculous, but in that moment, the thought of that completely paralyzed me. I felt frozen at the top of the stairs. I could not bring myself to actually look down into the darkness. I pulled out my phone and tried to take a picture of the basement from the top of the stairs, hoping the flash would show me if anything was down there. But the basement was just too deep and dark, and the photo turned out completely pitch black. I was just too terrified to go down there myself, especially with Rex growling like that. I quickly shut the basement door and locked it. I hurried into the bedroom and closed that door too. Eventually, Rex seemed to calm down a bit, and he came into the bedroom and lay down at the foot of the bed. He was no longer barking or growling, but he did not go to sleep. Instead, he sat there completely upright, staring intently at the closed bedroom door. He looked like he was on high alert, waiting for something to happen. Honestly, seeing him act like that was even more terrifying than his barking. I barely slept at all that night. Every single time I started to drift off, I would startle awake, expecting the bedroom door to fly open. When the morning finally came, I was exhausted. I got out of bed, brewed a hot cup of coffee, and tried to get my mind off of things. I decided that the best way to handle my nerves was to stay busy. I had a lot of household chores that I had been neglecting, so I decided to spend the day cleaning. I went around the house gathering up all the dirty laundry. I carried the basket down the hall to the laundry room, but the moment I stepped inside, I froze. My heart jumped into my throat. The washing machine, which was usually pushed flat against the back wall, was sitting several feet out into the room. It was nearly in the very middle of the small laundry room. I literally dropped my laundry basket and ran out of the room. I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding, trying to understand how this was possible. A washing machine does not just walk itself into the middle of a room. Once I managed to calm myself down a little bit, I cautiously walked back into the laundry room to inspect it. The washing machine was not running, and it had not been used since the day before. Everything else in the room looked completely normal. There were no water leaks, and nothing else had been disturbed. I grabbed the sides of the heavy machine and tried to push it back into its place. It was incredibly heavy, and it took a lot of physical effort for me to slide it back against the wall. As I struggled to move it, I kept thinking to myself that if the machine had somehow moved on its own, it would have made a massive, deafening scraping sound. There was no way I would not have heard that happening, even if I was asleep. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach, but I tried to keep a rational mind. I continued with my chores, trying to convince myself that there had to be some logical explanation. A little while later, I called Ryan. I told him about the basement, about Rex barking, and about the washing machine being moved. I could hear the skepticism in his voice. He tried to reassure me, suggesting that maybe the washing machine had vibrated itself forward during its last spin cycle, or that I was just letting the history of the house get to me. Ryan is one of those people who believes that absolutely everything in the world can be explained by science and logic. He is not a believer in the paranormal at all, but even though he was trying to rationalize it, I could tell he was still a bit concerned because of how upset I was. He told me that he and his friends were going to pack up and head back first thing in the morning. He promised he would be home by late morning on Sunday, which was much earlier than they had originally planned. Knowing he was coming back early helped comfort me a little bit, but I still had this terrible, lingering feeling of dread deep in my chest. Saturday night arrived, and the atmosphere in the house felt even heavier than before. I did the exact same thing I did on Friday. I got some food, sat on the couch, and kept Rex right next to me. I turned on the office and cranked the volume up, hoping the noise would drown out any strange sounds the house might make. It was exactly 9:18 in the evening when a massive, incredibly loud noise shattered the quiet night. Even with the television volume turned up high, the sound was so loud that it made me jump right off the couch. It sounded like a massive explosion had just occurred right outside. A split second later, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a notification from our home security application, alerting me that motion had been detected by the camera in the garage. I quickly opened the application and pulled up the live video feed. What I saw made no sense. In the video, the garage door was wide open. This was incredibly alarming, because we literally never used the garage door. We did not park our cars in there because both of our vehicles were too large to fit comfortably. We only used the garage to store old boxes and tools, and the big garage door was always kept shut and locked. But in the video feed, the door was wide open, and I could see bright, flashing lights reflecting off the driveway outside. The video quality was a bit grainy, and the audio sounded like a series of rapid fireworks going off. I was absolutely terrified, but I felt like I had to check. I walked over to the door inside the house that led into the garage. I opened it slightly and peered out toward the driveway, but when I looked, there was absolutely nothing there. The driveway was completely dark, and there was no smoke, no smell of gunpowder, and no physical evidence of fireworks or an explosion of any kind. It was completely silent. I slowly retreated back into the house, pulled up the application again, and used the remote control to close the garage door. My heart was racing so fast I could hear it in my ears. I went to the bedroom and locked myself inside. I could not figure out what was happening. Was there some kind of invisible, malevolent presence in the house? Or was there an actual human being outside, playing some kind of sick, elaborate prank on me? I could not sleep. I got out of bed 3 separate times to walk around the house and double-check that the main security alarm was set and that all the doors were locked. Just like the night before, Rex stood guard at the foot of the bed. He was staring directly at the bedroom door, occasionally letting out a low warning growl. Eventually, sheer exhaustion took over, and I managed to fall into a light, restless sleep. But my rest did not last long. I was suddenly jolted awake by a violent, aggressive pounding. Someone was slamming their fists against my front door. I looked down at my phone on the nightstand, and the clock read 3:39 in the morning. The banging was relentless. It was not a polite knock. It was a heavy, continuous pounding, like someone was trying to break the door down with their bare hands. I had closed the bedroom door before going to sleep, and Rex was trapped in the room with me. He was standing by the door, growling fiercely. I lay in bed, completely paralyzed with fear. I could not have moved my legs even if I tried. The pounding continued for what felt like an eternity, and And then, the house became quiet for just a brief second, followed by a sound that made my blood run cold. The automated voice of the security system rang out through the house, saying, "Front door open." My heart completely stopped. Someone had just opened the front door. I scrambled out of bed, rushed to the bedroom door, and locked it from the inside. I grabbed my phone, desperately trying to turn it on to call the police. But when I pressed the power button, the screen stayed completely black. It would not turn on. I kept pressing the button over and over, but nothing happened. I was so terrified that I began to cry, silent tears streaming down my face as I stood there in the dark. That was when I looked down and saw the doorknob of my bedroom door. In the dim light, I could clearly see the metal doorknob shaking violently. Someone was on the other side of the door, trying to get in. I lost all control and started screaming at the top of my lungs, telling them to go away, that the police were on their way. I kept frantically pressing the buttons on my phone, and finally, by some miracle, the screen flickered to life. I immediately dialed 911 and told the dispatcher that someone had broken into my house and was trying to get into my bedroom. The police responded incredibly fast. Within minutes, I heard the sirens approaching, and then I heard the officers entering the house. I finally unlocked my bedroom door and went out to meet them. The officers searched the entire house, but they found absolutely no one. They told me that the front door was wide open when they arrived, but there were no signs of a forced entry, and absolutely nothing had been stolen from the house. There was no physical evidence of any foul play whatsoever. I showed the officers the video from the garage camera from earlier that night. They looked at it and dismissed it, saying it was probably just some local teenagers setting off fireworks in the neighborhood, even though there was no debris on the driveway. As for the front door opening, one of the officers actually looked me in the eye and told me that it must have been the wind. He suggested that the door had not been latched properly, and a strong gust of wind must have pushed it open. I could not believe what I was hearing. It was a hot, humid, sticky July night. There was barely a breeze outside, let alone a gust of wind strong enough to blow open a heavy door that had been locked with a deadbolt. It was clear they just wanted to close the call and leave. After the police left, it was already starting to get light outside. I was too terrified to stay in that house for another second. I grabbed Rex, got into my car, and drove straight to my parents' house. I stayed there, shaking, until Ryan finally got home later that morning. I told my parents and Ryan everything that had occurred. My parents seemed to believe the police's explanation, comforting me but suggesting it was all just a series of strange coincidences and anxiety. Ryan, however, could see how visibly shaken I was. He did not believe it was anything paranormal, but he agreed that something very strange had happened, and he was deeply concerned for my safety. We ended up staying in that house for another 2 months, because we had to wait for the closing on our new home. But during those 2 months, we never experienced another strange occurrence. Nothing ever moved, no doors opened, and the basement remained completely quiet. It has been almost 3 years since that terrifying weekend, and I still have no explanation for what happened. I just hope I never have to experience anything like that ever again. But as scary as that was, there are other kinds of intrusions that are far more direct and personal, where you can see the person who is trying to disrupt your life. This brings us to the next story, which was told by a young man who used to live next door to a local bar. He absolutely hated the location. It was not like the bar was sitting right next to his property line. There was actually a thick line of trees that grew all the way around the bar, which did offer a decent amount of privacy and blocked most of the noise during the day. However, from his driveway, if he looked through the trees at just the right angle, he could literally see the side entrance of the bar. That specific area was where everyone would go outside to stand around, smoke cigarettes, and talk. Most of the time, it was not too unbearable. But on the weekends, or on nights when the local sports teams were playing a big game, it was absolutely horrible. The bar would be packed to maximum capacity, and the patrons would get incredibly loud. To make things even more difficult, he was working a retail job at the time. This meant he had to work almost every single weekend, while the crowd at the bar was partying it up and shouting. He was inside his house, lying in bed, desperately trying to get some sleep before his early morning shifts. Out of all the annoying and loud nights he had to deal with over the years, there was one specific Saturday night that would end up staying with him for the rest of his life. It was a night that he says will probably haunt him forever. His best friend, a woman named Ela, was coming over to hang out. Ela was like a sister to him. They had been close friends since they were kids in elementary school, and they had stayed close ever since. Around this time, Ela had made it her mission to set him up with someone. She was always trying to find him a girlfriend. This was back before the modern dating apps had become super popular, which was unfortunate for him because he was an incredibly shy and socially awkward person. He found it very difficult to strike up conversations with strangers, and the thought of just going up to a random woman and asking her out on a date seemed more terrifying than any scary movie you could think of. He was a self-described dork, and he loved that about himself. He loved his comic books, his collectible figures, and more than anything, he loved just relaxing at home. It is pretty hard to meet new people when being a homebody is a core part of your identity. That was why Ela was trying to be his ultimate wingman, though it was not going very well. He had been on a few blind dates she set up, but nothing had ever come of them. On this Saturday night, Ela came over to have dinner and hang out for a while until her girlfriend got out of her late shift at work. They had a great night together, and she gave him some of her classic dating tips to try out the next time he went on a date. Around 10 o'clock that night, her girlfriend called to say she was leaving work. He walked Ela out to her car in the driveway to say goodbye. As he stood there watching her car drive away down the dark street, he heard the familiar loud noises coming from the bar next door. He glanced over through the trees and saw a group of maybe 7 or 8 girls. They were clearly drinking, laughing, and feeling very good. They were talking loudly, and he could easily hear every single word one of the girls was saying to her friend. He shook his head, feeling a bit annoyed, and was getting ready to turn around and walk back inside his house. But that was when he noticed something strange. One of the girls in the group was looking directly in his direction. He looked around to see if she could have been staring at someone else, but there was nobody. It was just him standing in his driveway. The woman continued to stare at him, completely ignoring her friends who were talking around her. After a minute, the other girls in the group finished their cigarettes and began to head back inside the bar. But this one woman stayed behind. She lingered in the smoking area, separating herself from the group, and then she raised her hand and began to wave. He froze. There was absolutely no doubt about it now. She was waving directly at him. He did not wave back at first because he felt incredibly awkward and did not want to encourage her. But then she started waving even more aggressively, swinging her arm back and forth. Hesitantly, just to be polite, he raised his hand and gave her a quick, brief wave back. The moment he did, the woman smiled widely, raised her hand to her lips, and blew a kiss directly in his direction. He felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. He quickly forced a polite smile, turned around, and walked back inside his house, locking the door behind him. He figured she was just a customer who had had a few too many drinks and was just messing around. Once he was back inside, he decided to take advantage of his rare weekend off by playing some video games. He sat on his couch, booted up his favorite game, and completely forgot about the strange woman outside. He lost track of time as he played, enjoying the quiet of his own home. It was around 1:30 in the morning when he was suddenly startled by a sound. It was a very soft, gentle knock at his front door. He paused his game and sat completely still, listening closely. A moment later, he heard the gentle knock again. He was not immediately terrified. Because his house was so close to the bar, he was actually quite used to drunk people occasionally wandering onto his property or getting confused and knocking on his door. He had dealt with rowdy partygoers before, so he figured this was just another drunk person who had lost their way. Just to be safe, he stood up, walked over to the front door, and looked out the small glass window next to the frame. But when he looked out onto the front porch, there was absolutely no one there. The porch was empty. This pretty much confirmed his theory that it was just some idiot from the bar playing a game or walking away after realizing they had the wrong house. Even though he tried to dismiss it, his heart was still beating a little faster. It is always a bit unsettling to hear a knock at your door in the middle of the night. He decided he was done playing video games for the night. He sat down in the living room with his laptop. and started reading some articles, trying to let his adrenaline level drop. About 15 minutes passed, and he decided to get up and check out the front window one more time, just to satisfy his curiosity and make sure nobody was lurking in his yard. When he looked out into the darkness, he did not see any people, but he immediately noticed something strange about his car. The interior dome light of his car was shining brightly in the dark driveway. He focused his eyes, squinting through the glass, and realized that his driver's side door was sitting slightly ajar. He felt a surge of anger. He assumed that someone from the bar had tried to break into his car to see if there was anything valuable to steal. This was not the first time this had happened to him. Luckily for him, he never kept anything of value in his vehicle, so there was nothing for anyone to take. But the last time someone had left his car door open like that, the interior light had stayed on all night and completely drained his battery, leaving him stranded the next morning. He did not want to deal with a dead battery again. He unlocked his front door, stepped out onto the porch, and walked over to his car. Before he shut the door, he leaned in and checked the back seat, making sure there was no one hiding inside. The car was empty. He pushed the door shut, locked it with his key fob, and quickly walked back inside his house. As soon as he stepped back inside his living room and locked the deadbolt, he noticed a very strong, distinct smell in the air. It was a sweet, heavy scent like lavender perfume. It was incredibly strong, almost overpowering. He thought about it for a second, wondering if it could have been left behind by Hila. But Hila never wore perfume, and even if she had, there was no way the smell would have suddenly appeared in the living room hours after she had left. He realized the scent must have come from whoever had knocked on his front door earlier. They must have been wearing an excessive amount of perfume, and the scent had lingered on his front porch and drifted inside when he opened the door to go to his car. The thought made him feel a bit uneasy, but he tried to put it out of his mind. He shut down his laptop, turned off his video game console, and decided it was finally time to go to bed. He went into his bedroom, climbed under the covers, and put on a movie to help him fall asleep. He lay there for a while, letting the sound of the movie fill the room. But then, he heard a sound that did not belong to the movie. He immediately muted the television and sat up in bed, straining his ears to listen. He could hear something moving around outside his bedroom. It sounded like light, rapid footsteps moving quickly back and forth through the hallway. It was a delicate, soft sound, like someone running on their tiptoes. He sat frozen in his bed, his heart hammering against his ribs, and then through the silence of the house, he heard another sound. It was a soft, feminine giggle. Hearing that giggle made his blood run cold. There was definitely someone inside his house. He slowly slid out of bed, careful not to make a single sound. He crept over to his bedroom door, which was cracked open, and quietly pushed it completely shut, locking it from the inside. He grabbed his phone and immediately called the police, whispering to the dispatcher that an intruder was inside his home, likely someone who had wandered in from the bar next door. He stayed locked in his bedroom, waiting for the police to arrive. Every single second felt like an hour. He stood by the door, listening intently, but the sound of the rapid footsteps and the giggling had stopped. The house was completely silent again. After a few minutes, he decided he could not just stand there and wait. He needed to defend himself. He walked over to his closet and grabbed one of his dad's old golf clubs that he kept stored in the corner. Armed with the golf club, he slowly unlocked his bedroom door and stepped out into the dark hallway. He crept through the house, holding the club tightly in both hands, checking the corners as he went. He made his way toward the kitchen, but as soon as he reached the doorway, he stopped dead in his tracks. His entire body went completely numb with fear. Standing in the middle of his kitchen, bathed in the moonlight coming through the window, was a small blonde woman. She was wearing an old, tattered, dirty pink dress. She was standing completely still, staring out the kitchen window. He immediately recognized her. It was the exact same woman from the bar who had waved at him and blown him a kiss earlier that night. Before he could even find his voice to speak, the woman, without turning around, spoke in a quiet, chilling voice. She said, "Hey buddy, I know you are there." A second later, she whipped her head around, her eyes wide and wild, and stared directly at him. Her face twisted into a terrifying smile, and she suddenly sprinted straight toward him. He did not hesitate. He dropped his golf club, turned around, and ran as fast as he could into the bathroom. He slammed the door shut, locked it, and put his entire body weight against it. A split second later, she threw her body against the door. She began pounding on the wood, laughing and crying at the same time, begging him to open the door and let her in. He stayed there, crying out in terror, holding the lock shut with all his strength. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he heard the sound of loud, heavy footsteps entering the house, followed by the voices of police officers. He heard them shouting, announcing their presence. He slowly unlocked the bathroom door and stepped out. The kitchen and living room were empty, except for the officers, who were searching the house with their flashlights. He looked down at the floor right outside the bathroom door and felt his stomach drop. Lying on the floor, right where the woman had been standing and pounding on the door, was a long, sharp steak knife. She had taken it from his kitchen block. The officers searched the property, but the woman was gone. They found that his back door was wide open, and they concluded that she must have run out into the backyard and disappeared into the trees when she heard the police sirens approaching. The next day, he went over to the bar and spoke with the owner, describing the blonde woman in the dirty pink dress. The owner immediately knew who he was talking about. He told him that the woman had come into the bar earlier that night, looking very disheveled and acting incredibly strange. She had been bothering the other customers, and eventually, the owner had to physically kick her out of the establishment. She had hung around outside in the smoking area for a while, but when the owner threatened to call the police on her, she had wandered away into the darkness. He never saw that woman ever again, and he thanked God every single day for that. He spent a long time trying to figure out how she had managed to get inside his locked house. The only logical explanation he could come up with was the moment he went outside to check on his car. While he was examining the vehicle and locking it, she must have been hiding in the bushes near his porch. When his back was turned, she must have slipped through the open front door and hidden inside the house before he came back in and locked it. It was a terrifying realization. He was incredibly lucky that he had reacted quickly enough to lock himself in the bathroom, or things could have ended in a horrific tragedy. As terrifying as it is to have an intruder enter your home through a moment of distraction, there is something even more insidious about an intruder who manages to find a way inside and actually lives among you for weeks without you ever knowing. This is exactly what happened to a woman named Julie, and her story is perhaps the most unsettling of all. Julie had spent most of her life being a solitary person. She was someone who truly thrived in her own company. She did not have many close friends, and whenever she dated someone, she usually ended up breaking off the relationship before things got too serious. She was not unhappy about this. She actually preferred it that way. She loved her independence, and being alone allowed her to focus entirely on her career. Julie was an incredibly successful interior designer. She worked with high-end clients, helping them design and decorate their luxury homes. Her job required her to travel frequently, visiting different cities and meeting people from all walks of life. But when she was not traveling, she did most of her design work from her home office. After years of hard work and saving her money, Julie was finally able to purchase her dream home. It was a beautiful, spacious house located in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. She moved in and spent the first 6 months happily decorating the space, turning it into her personal sanctuary. Because her business was doing so well, she was in high demand and could afford to be very selective about the clients she took on. This meant she spent a lot of time at home, working peacefully in her office. But a few months after she settled into the house, she started to notice a strange occurrence. Whenever she was sitting at her desk working, she would occasionally hear a very peculiar sound. It was not a constant noise, but it happened often enough to catch her attention. The sound was like a soft, heavy shuffling. It was hard to describe, but she said it sounded exactly like the noise of someone sliding a heavy cardboard box across the floor in the room next to her. The shuffling was always very brief, lasting only a second or two, but it was loud enough to break her concentration. At first, she simply ignored it. She figured it was just the house settling or perhaps the wind blowing outside. But as the weeks went on, the shuffling sound began to happen regularly. One quiet afternoon, while she was working on a design layout, she heard the loud shuffling sound directly above her head. She decided she could not ignore it any longer. She got up from her desk, walked out of her office, and went upstairs to investigate. She stood in the upstairs hallway, holding her breath, listening as hard as she could, but the house was completely silent. She walked through every single room upstairs, opening closets and checking behind doors, but everything was empty and undisturbed. She began to feel like she was losing her mind. She would hear the noise, run upstairs to catch whatever was making it, and find absolutely nothing. Eventually, she came up with a logical explanation. She decided that there must be squirrels or some other rodents that had managed to get inside the siding or under the roof of the house. She remembered that when she was a child, a family of squirrels had nested in the attic of her parents' house, and they had made all kinds of scratching and shuffling noises at night. Anyone who has ever had pests in their attic knows how loud and annoying they can be, and how much damage they can cause to the wiring and insulation. Once she convinced herself that the noise was just squirrels, her mind was at ease. She figured she would just call a pest control company to handle it whenever she had some free time. But Julie was incredibly busy with her work, and calling the exterminator kept slipping her mind. The shuffling noise continued for several more days. Every time she heard it, she would write herself a quick reminder note to call pest control, but she would always get distracted by her design projects. A few nights later, Julie was working exceptionally late. She was sitting at her computer in her home office, lost in her work, and did not realize how late it had gotten. It was past 2 o'clock in the morning when she finally shut down her computer and went upstairs to bed. She climbed into bed, turned off the lights, and lay there in the dark, waiting to drift off to sleep. And then she heard the shuffling sound again, but this time it was different. When she heard it from her office, it was always a quick single shuffle. But now, as she lay in her quiet bedroom, the sound was continuous. It sounded like something was slowly and deliberately crawling directly above her head. The sound was so close and so distinct that she felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She got out of bed, stood up on the mattress, and pressed her ear against the drywall of the ceiling, trying to hear better. The shuffling sound suddenly stopped the moment she touched the ceiling. But in the silence that followed, she heard something else. It was a sound that made her heart freeze. She could hear the distinct rhythmic sound of heavy breathing. It was a deep, raspy breath coming from the other side of the ceiling. The thought of it was absolutely terrifying. She knew that directly above her bedroom was a small crawl space that served as a tiny attic. The crawl space was very low and difficult to access, so she had never used it for storage or even looked inside it since she moved in. But now, she realized that the crawl space was positioned directly over her bed. She stood on her mattress, her heart pounding, trying to convince herself that she was just imagining things, that it was just her own breathing echoing back at her, or maybe a large animal like a raccoon. But deep down, she knew it sounded human. She decided she had to know for sure. She stepped down from the bed and walked out into the hallway, where the access panel to the crawl space was located. The panel had a pull-down string that was used to lower a folding wooden ladder. The string was tied to a small hook high up on the wall, so it would not hang down in the middle of the hall. Because Julie was relatively short, she had to fetch a wooden chair from the dining room and bring it upstairs so she could stand on it to reach the string. She placed the chair under the panel, stepped up, and grabbed the string. She pulled it hard, but the heavy wooden panel seemed to be stuck. She gave it another violent pull, and with a loud creaking sound, the panel finally released, and the wooden ladder folded down into the hallway. She stood on the chair, looking up into the dark opening of the crawl space. She felt a wave of intense fear, realizing how vulnerable she was standing there on the chair. She slowly climbed up a few rungs of the ladder, poking her head through the dark opening. She reached out and flipped her phone's flashlight on, shining the beam into the dusty, cramped space. The crawl space was very low, with thick wooden beams running along the floor and insulation piled in between. The light from her phone was weak, and she could only see a few feet in front of her. On either side of the space, there were two large, thick wooden support pillars that blocked her view of the corners. She did not see anything unusual in the brief moment she looked. Terrified of what she might find if she stayed up there any longer, she quickly climbed back down the ladder, pushed the wooden steps back up into the ceiling, and shut the panel. She tried to secure the string back onto the wall hook, but her hands were shaking so badly that she could not get it to stay. She decided to just leave it and went back downstairs to the living room. She turned on the television, hoping the bright screen and the noise would distract her from her thoughts. She sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, too terrifically scared to go back to sleep in her bedroom. Eventually, as the hours passed, she began to doze off on the couch. But her sleep was restless. While she was drifting in and out of consciousness, she was suddenly startled awake by a very specific sound. It was the distinct creaking sound of a heavy wooden door opening. The sound was sharp and clear, and it woke her up instantly. She sat up on the couch, her eyes wide, scanning the dark living room and kitchen. Everything looked normal. She stood up and walked cautiously into the kitchen, looking around the counters and the back door. The door was locked, and there was no one there. She walked out of the kitchen and into the long dark hallway that led to her home office. The hallway was pitch black, so she reached out and flipped the wall switch, turning on the overhead lights. She half expected to see someone standing at the end of the hall, but the hallway was completely empty. She walked down to her office, checked inside, and found everything exactly as she had left it. Feeling a little foolish, she decided to head back upstairs to bed, thinking her mind was just playing tricks on her because of her lack of sleep. But as she climbed the stairs and reached the top landing, she stopped. The pull-down string for the crawl space ladder, which she had left hanging near the wall, was now dangling straight down in the very middle of the hallway. And even more terrifying, the white string was slowly swaying back and forth, as if someone had just touched it. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She tried to tell herself that the draft from the heating vent must have moved it, but she knew that was impossible. She slowly walked down the hall toward her bedroom, and as she got closer, she noticed that her bedroom door was almost completely shut. She always, without fail, left her bedroom door wide open, so her cat could wander in and out. She reached out and grabbed the doorknob to open it. As she pushed the door, it let out a loud, drawn-out creaking sound. That was the exact sound that had woken her up downstairs. Someone had opened this door. She pushed the door open and turned on the bedroom light. The room looked completely normal. Her bed was messy from when she had stood on it, but nothing else seemed out of place. She stood in the doorway, her heart hammering in her chest, wondering if she should just grab her keys and leave the house. But then, as she looked down at the hardwood floor, she noticed something. Right next to the side of her bed, there was a small clump of dark, wet dirt. It looked like someone had tracked mud onto the clean floor. Julie felt a knot of pure terror tighten in her stomach. She slowly walked over to the side of the bed, her eyes fixed on the dirt. She slowly knelt down on one knee, intending to look under the bed, but as she bent over, she heard that sound again. It was the distinct, wet sound of heavy breathing coming from directly beneath the mattress. Julie got down on both hands and knees, leaning her head low to the floor, and looked under the bed frame. Lying flat on his back in the dark space beneath her bed, staring directly into her eyes with a wide, unblinking grin, was a middle-aged man. He was dirty, his hair was matted, and his clothes were covered in dust. Julie let out a blood-curdling scream and threw herself backward, landing hard on her palms. The man did not slide out from under the bed immediately, but he spoke in a calm, chillingly familiar voice. He said, "Hi, Julie, it is okay." He repeated it over and over, his voice echoing in the small room. "It is okay, Julie, it is okay." Julie felt like her legs had turned to lead. She struggled to stand up, scrambling backward out of the bedroom, her heart beating so violently she thought she might faint. She finally managed to get to her feet, sprinted down the stairs, grabbed her car keys and her phone from the kitchen counter, and ran out the front door. She jumped into her car, started the engine, and sped out of the driveway, leaving the front door open. She drove blindly through the dark streets until she spotted the bright neon lights of a 24-hour diner. She parked her car, ran inside, and collapsed into a booth, crying hysterically. The diner staff immediately realized something was terribly wrong and helped her call the police. The dispatcher sent a patrol car to the diner to check on Julie, while several other units were dispatched directly to her home. When the officers arrived at the house, they found the front door wide open, just as she had left it. They entered the home with their weapons drawn and searched every single room, closet, and corner. But the man was gone. He had fled the scene before the police arrived. However, when the officers climbed the ladder into the crawl space above her bedroom, they found undeniable evidence of his presence. Tucked behind one of the thick wooden support pillars, they found a small dirty pillow, several empty plastic water bottles, wrappers from food he had stolen from her pantry, and a small notebook. It was clear that this man had been living in her crawl space for weeks, directly above her head, listening to her every move. He had been coming down into her house at night while she was asleep, stealing food and water, and then retreating back into the darkness of the ceiling before she woke up. Julie was too terrified to ever step foot in that house again. She checked into a local motel and stayed there for nearly a month while her real estate agent frantically worked to put the house back on the market. She spent thousands of dollars installing advanced security systems, motion sensors, and cameras in her new home, but the psychological scars of that night never fully healed. The police investigated the incident, but they were never able to identify or locate the intruder. He had vanished into the night, leaving no fingerprints or DNA that matched any records, but Julie had her own theory about who the man was. Years earlier, her dad had an old family friend who had become deeply obsessed with Julie. He had started showing up at her work, sending her strange letters, and acting incredibly inappropriate, eventually forcing her dad to cut him off entirely. The last time Julie had seen him, he was much younger, but the man under her bed had looked like a much older, more disheveled version of that same family friend. And the fact that he knew her name, calling her Julie as he lay under her bed, made her almost certain it was him. If it was, it meant he had tracked her down, discovered where she lived, and figured out a way to sneak into her home and live inside her ceiling. It is a terrifying reminder that sometimes, even locking your doors and windows is not enough to keep out the monsters that are determined to find you. These 3 stories illustrate a terrifying truth about our safety. We tend to think of our homes as impenetrable fortresses, places where we can close the door and lock out the rest of the world. We build our lives around the assumption that the locks on our doors and the glass in our windows are enough to keep us secure. But the truth is, the line between safety and danger is incredibly thin, and it can be crossed in a single moment of distraction. Whether it is a stranger who slips inside while you are checking on your car, a historic house that holds dark, unexplained secrets, or a person who quietly climbs into your ceiling and watches you from the dark, the threat can be much closer than you think. It is enough to make anyone double-check their locks, look closely into the shadows, and listen a little more carefully to the strange creaks and shuffles in the middle of the night. After all, you never truly know who might be listening back, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the darkness and make themselves known. It is a thought that stays with you, lingering long after the sun comes up and the night has passed, reminding us to never take our peace of mind for granted. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Back before phones and social media took over the planet, we actually had to go outside as kids. Maybe it is just where I live, but I do not see kids riding their bikes around, or playing ding-dong ditch, or doing any of those late-night troublesome kid activities anymore. But when I was a kid, and I am talking anywhere from 9 to 17 years old, I was always outside with friends. At my childhood home, there was a park down the block from me that some of my friends and I would use as a hangout spot, especially at night since our parents would get mad at us for being loud inside the house. The park was perfect because it had a small patch of woods on 3 sides, and then it faced the street on the 4th side. Across from the park was another small patch of woods. So basically, we did not have any neighboring houses watching us or calling the police on us for making too much noise when we were in the park. This happened when I was about 13 years old. That was the age where we were riding our bikes to get literally everywhere, every single day. I think that day in question was a Saturday, and we had ridden to a nearby pizza place a little earlier in the afternoon. We spent about an hour there, stuffing our faces with pepperoni pizza and drinking soda, just talking about video games and school. After eating, we went back to my friend Tani's house, which was also not far from my house. The 6 of us were hanging out in his backyard, laughing and talking, running around and just being typical loud teenagers until his mom came outside and yelled at him. She came out of the back door with a very angry look on her face and told him to either be quiet, send his friends home, or go hang out somewhere else because we were making way too much noise. By this point, 3 of our other friends decided to just call it a night and go home. But me, Tony, and our friend Rob decided to go ride to the park instead of going home. It was only about a 5-minute bike ride, and there was always something so refreshing about riding bikes at night. The air was cool, the streets were completely empty, and the hum of our bicycle tires on the asphalt was the only sound. It felt easier, and it felt more relaxing than riding during the hot afternoon. So, the 3 of us got to the park. To describe the park besides its surroundings, the actual park had a small baseball field, a small bleacher stand, a couple of typical park benches, and a pretty decently sized playground with a swing set. We would always chill on the actual playground structure, because it was a cool, elevated, hidden surface to just sit on and hang out. We climbed up the plastic steps to the top platform of the playground, which was about 6 feet off the ground. We sat there with our legs dangling over the edge, just talking and enjoying the quiet night. But at some point when we were chilling on the playground, Tony suddenly went, "Shh, did you hear that?" And we all stopped talking for a few moments to listen. The entire park went dead silent. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, but nothing else happened. Tony explained that he thought he heard a footstep, or some kind of thump on the playground structure that was not from us. So, naturally, we all kind of took a quick glance around the playground and ultimately did not see anyone. But probably a few minutes later, there was a sound that we all heard this time. And it did sound like some kind of heavy thud emanating from somewhere on the physical playground itself. It sounded like someone had stepped heavily onto the wooden platform right behind us. Now, we were slightly unsettled, because we were almost certain someone else was there making that noise. So, we took another peep, this time actually getting up and walking around the playground equipment, looking under the platforms, and we even called out asking who was there. Of course, there was no response. The darkness of the surrounding woods made everything look like a shadow, so we could not be completely sure. Eventually, we settled back down up on the playground platform, trying to brush it off as our imagination. We talked for another few minutes until we heard yet another sound. This time, it was a much more unsettling sound. It was the sound of a voice. It was a child's voice, and it came from inside the slide. It was one of those twirling metal slides you see at most typical public playgrounds. I am not going to lie, when we all heard it, we genuinely freaked out. Even though yes, we did hear some weird sounds on the playground, we did not hear anyone climbing into the slide, and the thumping sounds definitely did not come from the slide itself. So naturally, I walked over to the top of the slide and listened closely. I bent down near the metal opening and asked, "Is someone in there?" And a voice said back, "Hello." It was a child's voice. I want to say it sounded like a boy. They sounded like a toddler, very young and soft. I was 90% sure they said hello. My friends heard it too, and we all gave each other these terrified looks. We had not heard anyone in the slide for the entire half hour we had been there, and it was pitch black inside that metal tube. I sat down near the entrance of the slide and asked, "Do you need help?" But there was no response now. In fact, we did not hear the voice again. I had to assume there was a little kid stuck in there who was too scared to talk. So I decided to climb in and slide down to help them. But as I slid down, expecting a child to appear around the corner the entire time, instead, I made it all the way to the bottom, only to find it was completely empty. I landed on the wood chips at the bottom of the slide, looked up into the tube, and there was nothing there. I then did a scan around the ground level of the playground and the surrounding area, and there was not a single soul in sight. My friends were just as shocked as I was. There was literally not a soul besides us around, and I am telling you, it was not possible for someone to have run away that quickly, especially not a young child. We checked every possible place to hide, behind the swing set, under the platforms, behind the benches, and there was absolutely no one. We were already beyond freaked out, but when we heard the same voice once again come from inside the slide, this time saying, "Catch me," we all bolted for our bikes. We did not even look back. We grabbed our handlebars, jumped onto our seats, and pedaled faster than we ever had before, heading straight back to my house down the block. We did not stop until we reached my backyard. We regrouped and caught our breath, our chests heaving and our hearts hammering. We were trying to be very quiet, though, since my dad was likely asleep already, and he would get mad if we were making noise outside. So, we sat amongst ourselves talking about what had just happened and trying to think of any possible rational explanations. Maybe it was some kind of weird echo from the street, or maybe someone was playing a prank on us. But things only got stranger when there was suddenly a knocking sound on the wooden backyard gate. Yes, like someone was knocking as if asking permission to come in. It was a slow, deliberate knock, 3 times. I called out in a whispered voice and said, "Who is that?" I was thinking maybe it was a family member, but it was an unfamiliar woman's voice that replied. She said hello, and then she said, "Were you guys just at the park before?" We once again looked at each other in absolute nervousness. How did she know we were at the park? How did she follow us so quickly? There was a tiny crack in the gate where it met the wooden fence that you could look through and see to the other side. So I slowly peeked through it, and what I saw was a woman. She was middle-aged, standing on the other side with this big, wide, creepy grin on her face. Her mouth was stretched open in a way that looked completely unnatural, and she was already looking right at me through the crack, as if she knew exactly where to look. I stepped back away from the gate because it was such a disturbing sight. I backed away and said, "No, sorry." The woman replied back, "Are you sure?" And Tony replied for me, saying, "No, we were not." The woman said, "Okay, thanks anyway." I stepped back toward the gate to see if she had left, but she was still standing right there, smiling and looking directly at me through the crack without blinking. We were so freaked out that we ran inside my house through the back door and locked it behind us. We quietly hung out downstairs for a while, completely shook, waiting for morning. That woman was terrifying. Everything about her was off. My friends were too scared to get their bikes and leave, so they ended up sleeping over and they left in the morning. We did not go back to that park for a very long time after that night. If we really wanted to explain it all away, we could go with the explanation that there was a kid who ran away from his mother and was playing at the park, and the mother was looking for her child. But it does not make sense because we rode home on our bikes so quickly that no one on foot would have been able to see where we went or follow us that fast. Also, we know for a fact that we did not see any kid running around the playground. So, what the actual hell did we hear inside of that slide? Who was that woman? At this point, it is a distant memory that will simply never be solved. I never thought a normal walk in the park could turn into one of the scariest nights of my life, but it did. I live in a small suburban town. It is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, and most people think it is completely safe to be outside at any time of the night. It was a Friday night in the summer of 2018. I had just finished a very late shift at work, and my brain was completely fried. I wanted to clear my head before going home to sleep, so I decided to take a walk. The local park was only a few blocks away from my apartment, and I used it a lot to jog or just walk when I needed to think. That night, it was quiet. It was almost too quiet. The sun had set maybe an hour before, and the streetlights inside the park were on, but the main walking path still felt shadowed under the thick trees. I remember thinking how peaceful it was as I entered the park. The smell of freshly cut grass was lingering in the air, and a gentle breeze was blowing. I was not expecting anyone else to be there. Most of the time on a weekday night, I would be completely alone, or maybe I would see a few people walking their dogs, or a couple of teenagers sitting on the benches. I had my headphones in, listening to music at a very low volume so I could still hear my surroundings, and I started walking along the main path. At first, everything was completely normal. I noticed a couple of dogs running in the distance, and some people walking slowly, laughing quietly together near the entrance. It felt calm and almost therapeutic, but then I started noticing little things that made me feel uneasy, though at the time I tried my best to brush them off. The first thing I noticed was a man sitting on a wooden bench not far from the path. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled all the way up over his head, even though it was a warm summer night and not cold at all. He was not doing anything in particular. He was just sitting there with his hands in his pockets, staring straight ahead. I did not think much of it at first. People sit on park benches all the time. But as I passed him, I realized he was looking directly at me. He did not move when I walked by, and he did not even shift his eyes away from me. It made me extremely uncomfortable, so I picked up my pace a little bit, telling myself he was probably just a harmless guy enjoying the night. I kept walking, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, but then I heard footsteps behind me. I paused, and the footsteps stopped. I waited for a few seconds, looking around, then continued walking. They started again, matching my pace exactly. My heart started to beat faster, but I told myself it was probably just someone else taking their own walk. Still, the footsteps were too deliberate, too in sync with mine. I decided to take a different path, one that led through a smaller section of the park with fewer lights. The main path was still ahead, but I wanted to cut through a side trail that loops back toward the street. I figured I could get home faster that way and maybe avoid whoever was behind me. As I turned onto the trail, I noticed the man from the bench had stood up and was walking in the same direction. I thought maybe it was just a coincidence, but something about the way he moved made me stop and stare. He was not jogging or taking a normal stroll. It was slow, almost like he was matching my pace without looking directly at me. I took out my phone and checked the time, then pretended to make a phone call, holding it up to my ear and talking to an imaginary person. The man did not react to this at all. He did not seem to care that I was looking at him. I forced myself to keep walking, trying not to panic. I thought maybe if I went faster, he would eventually leave me alone. I broke into a light jog, and he did the exact same thing, keeping the same distance behind me. My mind raced with questions. Why was he following me? Was he dangerous? Should I run back the way I came? I made a quick decision to leave the park completely. There was a street exit just ahead that led back toward a well-lit neighborhood. I broke into a faster run, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode out of my chest. The footsteps behind me sped up, matching mine perfectly. I did not look back again. I just ran with everything I had. When I finally reached the well-lit street, I slowed down and risked glancing behind me. The man had stopped at the very edge of the park, standing in the shadows just inside the trees. I could see the hood over his head, a dark shape against the dimly lit path. He was not moving, just standing there watching me. I do not know how long I stood there staring back before I turned and ran all the way home. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly unlock my apartment door. I thought that would be the end of it. I told myself it was probably just a creepy guy who liked to follow people, maybe harmless. I kept trying to imagine rational explanations. Maybe he was lonely, maybe he was homeless, maybe he just liked watching people walk. I tried to go back to my normal life, but I could not stop thinking about that night. A few nights later, I was back at the same park, this time during the day, trying to convince myself that it was safe. I walked along the same path I had walked that night, scanning the area for anything unusual. Everything looked normal, and I started to relax a little. But then I noticed the same bench where I had first seen him. It was empty now, but someone had scratched something into the wood. I walked closer to look. I could not make out exactly what it said. It looked like letters carved hastily, some of them smeared as if whoever did it did not want it to be easily legible. My stomach turned instantly. I snapped a picture of the carving with my phone and walked away quickly. After that, I tried to avoid the park at night completely, but the worst part was not that I felt unsafe. It was the feeling that someone knew I had been there, that someone was waiting even when I was not looking. I started noticing small things in the neighborhood too. Shadows moving in the corner of my eye, a figure across the street that would vanish when I looked directly, a car parked down the block that I did not recognize, lights turning on in houses when I walked past. I kept telling myself it was just paranoia, that I was imagining things, but the memory of that night never left me. One evening, maybe 2 weeks later, I decided to go jogging again in the early evening, thinking it was safer than nighttime. I stayed on the main street, not going into the park at all. As I passed the edge of the park, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A figure was standing just inside the tree line, barely visible. It was the same height and build as the man from before, and the hood was up again. I froze in place. He did not move, but I had this overwhelming feeling that he had been there for hours, just watching. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move slowly, keeping my eyes on him. When I reached my car, I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove away, constantly glancing back in the rearview mirror. I never saw him again after that night. At least, not in the park. But sometimes when I walk through the neighborhood or even near my apartment, I get that same feeling that someone is watching me just beyond my line of sight. I have checked the park security cameras in the past, and nothing unusual shows up. No one was captured entering the park at night, and the areas I walked are supposed to be covered by cameras. I do not know if he was someone who knew how to avoid them, or if it was someone who had been living there without anyone noticing. The strangest part is that I never heard anything directly from him. No voice, no movement besides the footsteps, just that heavy presence. I have told my friends and family, but most of them dismiss it as paranoia. But I know what I experienced, and I cannot explain it. I have learned to avoid that park completely at night, and even in the day, I stay on the main streets. But the memory sticks with me. Sometimes late at night, I find myself staring at the dark tree line where he stood, wondering if he is still there, waiting for someone else. I never go back, but a small, irrational part of me feels like he could still be there, even now, hiding just out of sight, watching anyone who dares to walk alone. I do not know why he picked me, or if it was completely random. I do not know if he was dangerous or just interested. All I know is that feeling of being followed, of being watched without anyone else seeing. It is something I will never forget. Even writing this down now, I feel a chill remembering the quiet way he moved, how he stayed just out of reach but always present. I still take my walks, but I make sure I am never alone in the park after dark. And sometimes when I am home, I swear I hear the sound of footsteps outside. They are far enough away to be unnoticed by anyone else, but close enough to remind me that I might still be watched. I tell myself it is probably nothing. I hope it is. But I cannot shake the feeling that somewhere out there, he is still waiting, watching, and stalking me like he was that night. I never reported him to the police. There was no evidence or proof that anyone was there except me. I thought about it, but I could not even describe him clearly. Just a hoodie, a vague shape, and the feeling that he knew everything I was doing. The uncertainty is what haunts me the most. I have no idea who he was, why he was there, or if he is still around. Even walking past that park during the day now makes me tense. Even now, years later, if I am driving past, I sometimes feel like I see a figure standing at the edge of the trees. I cannot tell if it is real or just my imagination. I do not stop to find out. I just keep driving, hoping I never have to walk that path alone again. Now, this next event happened less than 24 hours ago. The details are still incredibly vivid in my head. I am not even sure how to classify this story because it was so incredibly bizarre. It was the only time in my life that I have ever felt like I was actually in serious danger. Myself and a group of 5 friends were hanging out at a popular public park in my area. People call it the Overlook because it has a great view of downtown and the nearby universities. It was very late in the evening, around 11 o'clock. It was supposed to be just a chill rendezvous. We had no plans of doing anything other than hanging out on the park benches and talking. However, one of my friends suddenly said that he had Roman candles in his trunk, and he suggested that we light them off. The Overlook is probably the worst place in the entire park to light fireworks because it is so open and visible. So I suggested we go to a more secluded part of the park instead, a place we call the Loop. The Loop is just a few minutes away from the Overlook, and most of it is completely surrounded by trees. So only people within that specific part of the park would be able to see what we were doing. All 6 of us piled into 2 separate cars and made our way over to the Loop. Although there was plenty of street parking within the Loop itself, we decided to park outside on a nearby street, just in case anything went wrong and we had to leave quickly. We started walking toward the actual Loop part, which is basically a huge cul-de-sac surrounded by dense woods. The driveway to the Loop is very long and winding, cutting through a thick tree line. You cannot see anything within the Loop from the outside because of how dense the trees are. As we walked, we noticed a few cars parked in different spots, but we thought nothing of it as people walk in this park frequently. Still, it was a little strange for such a late hour. As we walked deeper into the Loop, we noticed several cars parked around the cul-de-sac with their lights completely turned off. Suddenly, a truck behind us started moving, with its headlights turned off. It was originally facing the opposite direction, toward the entrance of the Loop, but it quickly made a sharp U-turn and started heading right in our direction. We all found this extremely strange, and we quickly hid behind some trees, The truck passed us slowly, then continued around the loop, drove back toward the entrance, stopped suddenly, and made another U-turn. All of our stomachs sank. The truck was small, probably only fitting 3 people, yet there were 6 of us and we were all over 6 feet tall. Still, we were frightened and creeped out by how this vehicle was behaving. For some reason, my friend thought that this was the perfect time to light a Roman candle, and sparks began to fly in our direction. The truck immediately turned its headlights on and started slowly driving directly toward us. We ran further into the tree line, which was on a downward slope, and we hid behind more trees. However, the truck went right over the curb and drove through the grass toward us. Whoever was driving must have seen us running, because they turned on their high beams and laid on the horn, letting out a long, deafening blast. We sprinted as fast as we could into the deep woods. These were not paths that people normally walked through. There were thick bushes and tall grass everywhere, making it extremely difficult to move. About 20 feet into the woods, we began hearing voices shouting from the truck, and we saw more pairs of headlights turn on from the loop behind us. During our chaotic sprint, we had become completely separated. I was with 2 of my friends, and we did not know where the other 3 had gone. But at that moment, that was not our main concern. 2 men stepped out of the truck and sprinted down into the woods carrying bright flashlights. My friends and I lay flat on the ground. Trying to stay as hidden as possible, I managed to squeeze under a large, low-hanging bush, but my other 2 friends were still partially exposed. We were in a sunken part of the woods, with part of the loop road directly above us. It was quiet for a few minutes, until we started hearing footsteps and saw flashlights shining down from the road above. We did not know if they could see us, but we were basically trapped. One group was searching for us from the front, and another group was searching from above us. We did not understand why they were so upset about the fireworks. None of them had come anywhere near their vehicles, and fireworks are legal in our state. All we could do was hide in silence and hope they did not find us. After about 15 minutes of tense silence, we saw the truck pull out of the grass and back onto the street, then drive away. The other headlights disappeared, but we never actually saw the men who had entered the woods come back out. To make matters worse, one of my friends realized he had lost his phone somewhere in the woods while we were running. Finding it was surprisingly easy because the screen lit up, but sneaking out of the woods and back onto the road leading to the loop was incredibly difficult. It was pitch black, and we could not use our flashlights or our phones because we did not want to alert the men of our location. We regrouped with one friend who had been hiding close by. He told us that one of the men had run right past him, but did not see him in the dark. However, he noticed that the man was carrying what looked like a large knife or some kind of melee weapon in his hand. After hearing this, we did not hesitate. We sprinted down the road toward the exit. That is when we noticed the same truck from earlier, parked about 50 feet from the entrance. Fortunately, a dense patch of woods nearby allowed us to sneak into it and move toward the exit without being in the open. Somehow, whoever was in the truck realized we had started moving, because they immediately turned on their high beams and pulled the truck right to the edge of the woods. At that point, we ran as fast as we possibly could. The truck followed us along the road, but we quickly cut deeper into the woods where the vehicle could not go. Eventually, we reached a main road that led completely out of the loop area. The truck did not follow us beyond the entrance. We took 2 different back roads to get back to our parked cars to make sure we were not being followed. We did not hear from our other 3 friends until a few hours later. They had managed to escape much quicker by running straight out without stopping to hide. I am never going back to the loop. I do not know what those people wanted or why they made such an aggressive effort to hunt us down in the woods, but I am absolutely sure it was not good. It felt like an eternity at the time, and I have never been more scared in my entire life. I truly did not know what was going to happen to us. The level of panic we felt while being hunted by those men with flashlights is something I cannot easily put into words. It was not just the fact that they were chasing us. It was the absolute silence of their approach and the realization that they were armed. If they had simply wanted to tell us to stop lighting fireworks, they could have shouted or stayed in their truck. Instead, they acted like a coordinated search party. trying to cut off our escape routes and corner us in the pitch-black woods. When we finally got back to my apartment and met up with the rest of the group, we spent hours talking about what had happened, trying to make sense of the situation. One of my friends pointed out that the cars parked in the loop with their lights off might have been part of some illegal meeting or drug transaction, and our fireworks might have spooked them into thinking the police were arriving, or that we were trying to record them. This seems like the most logical explanation, but it does not make the experience any less terrifying. The thought of those headlights turning on one by one in the dark, and the sound of those heavy boots marching through the dry leaves, still makes my hands shake. We were lucky to escape without any injuries, but the psychological scar is something that will stay with us for a very long time. The realization that a simple night out with friends can turn into a struggle for survival in a matter of seconds is a sobering thought. I have spent the last few hours looking at maps of the park, trying to trace our path through the woods and understand how we managed to get out. The density of the trees and the steepness of the slope make it a miracle that none of us tripped and broke a bone while running in the dark. It is clear that the men knew the layout of the park much better than we did, and they were using that knowledge to trap us. If it had not been for that dense patch of woods near the exit, we might not have made it back to our cars. I am sharing this story because I want people to realize that danger can find you even in places you consider safe and familiar. The Loop is a public park, a place where families go during the day, yet at night it became a hunting ground. We often take our safety for granted, assuming that nothing bad will happen to us as long as we are with friends. But the truth is, the world can be a very dark and unpredictable place, and you should always trust your instincts when something feels off. The memory of the truck idling at the edge of the woods, its high beams cutting through the trees, is something I will never forget. I keep wondering what would have happened if they had found us under that bush, or if my friend had not been able to find his phone. The uncertainty is the worst part, the unanswered questions that keep you awake at night. But for now, all I can do is stay away from that park, and hope that those men never find anyone else. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. A young man once decided to take a solo trek on the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania, which is the longest hiking-only trail in the world. He went alone for fun. Since it was late fall, it was cold, and he only ran into 2 other hikers going the opposite way. This part of the trail was in thick forests and was definitely a scenic walk. The trail ran alongside a river where nothing could be heard but the flowing water and early morning birds chirping. After walking for a while, it was time for him to sit down and take a break. He found a big rock sitting aside the river and sat down. He took a sip of his Gatorade, and then he could swear he heard a baby crying coming from the distance. It was coming from further down the trail, in the direction he was walking. Of course, he had to get up and follow the sound, because of that off chance that a baby was stranded in the woods alone. As he walked further down the trail, the baby crying stayed the same distance away. This went on for about half a minute of walking fast before he gave up and assumed it was someone with a baby walking down the trail. He sat down on another rock he found on the side of the trail by the river, trying to catch his breath. Eventually, the crying seemed to just stop. It did not fade away. It stopped abruptly. He sat on that rock for 5 minutes, taking in nature and taking a few videos on his phone. That was when he heard footsteps approaching. Expecting to see another hiker, he instead saw a frantic-looking woman hurrying over to him. She came so fast and so close that it actually scared him. She stopped uncomfortably close to his face and started screaming, asking if he had seen her baby. He calmly told her he heard a baby crying not too long ago and told her to follow him. They walked quickly down the trail, in the direction he was chasing the sounds earlier. He looked back every few seconds to make sure she was keeping up with him. Eventually, he asked her how on earth she lost her baby, but she did not answer. So he turned around again and stopped when he saw she was gone. The weird thing was, she was right on his tail just 10 seconds ago. He screamed out for her a few times, cupping his hands around his mouth, but the only sounds around him were the birds chirping in the river. He figured even if she trailed off away from him, he would at least still be able to see her in the distance. He stood there for a long time deciding what to do next. Should he just move on with his life and continue the trail, or walk back and try to find this woman? He did one more quick scan of the area they just came from. What he saw next was incredibly disturbing. In that very spot, he saw the woman standing across the river, her arms hanging lifelessly at her sides. She was looking at him, not saying anything, and not moving a muscle. She had a blank expression, just standing like a statue watching him. He decided to move the hell on with his life. He walked as fast as he could away from there, until his calves hurt from walking so fast. Eventually, he made it back to his car after looping around another trail, cutting his hike short. He was truly unsettled by what happened and started to question his sanity. It seemed so unreal, and yet at the same time it felt completely real. He wanted to know if anyone else had experienced something like this. Now, you might think that staying closer to a populated area would keep you safe. But for another young man, a late-night run in a suburban nature preserve turned into a literal fight for his life. He lived in a suburban area with little green space, except for a huge preserve near his house with miles of trails. One night in 2016, at around 11 o'clock, he decided to go for a run. He liked to avoid people when he went for runs. He held his phone with a tight grip, keeping the flashlight turned on, and started his run at the edge of the preserve onto the dirt hiking trail. He felt like he had more energy running at night, although it was hard to describe why. There were no lights at all in the preserve. It was entirely just dark nature. There was also a dead body that had been found in the preserve just the previous week, but he did not really let that concern him too much. He lived in one of the safest neighborhoods in the state, and it was a weeknight, so he assumed there was literally no one else in this preserve but him. Well, that was at least what he thought. He ran for about 10 minutes before his legs grew heavy and his muscles began to burn because he used to be quite out of shape back then. He had to stop to catch his breath, so he sat down on the first bench he found. He had to admit it was creepy as hell being in a pitch-black preserve like that all alone. It felt exactly the same as being alone in the middle of a forest. There were weird sounds coming from all around, and to be quite honest, it was scaring him. Of course, he assumed most of them were just animals. But then he heard leaves and sticks crunching nearby. He figured it was a raccoon or a fox. But anyone's worst nightmare came true when he noticed something tall hiding behind one of the trees. He could not quite tell what it was because an iPhone flashlight is only so bright. He stood up and walked a little closer, doing a crutch walk because for some reason he thought that would make him more low-key. He got close enough to where he saw a hand wrapped around one of the trees. The hand was wearing an old white glove. He felt his heart sink like he was suddenly in a life-or-death situation before he could even see who was behind that tree. Then, they finally decided to reveal themselves. Someone dressed as a clown stepped right into the range of his flashlight. This was back during the clown epidemic of 2016. From what he could see in the little light he had, this person had gone all out with his clown costume, from the makeup right down to the clown shoes. The most disturbing part was the bat he was holding, which had a large foot-long metal spike wedged straight through it. His head was angled down to give a more menacing, terrifying look, and he began to walk very slowly toward the runner. He had only one option, and that was to run as fast as he could, even though he was already so tired. He did not run on the trail. Instead, he ran straight into the woods until he felt like he was going to throw up. Then he shut off his flashlight and crouched down behind a tree. He heard running footsteps zoom past him, maybe 10 feet away. When the footsteps faded away into the distance, he ran back to the trail and ran all the way back the way he came. He actually puked by the time he made it to the street, just from running so much. Everyone in the community figured that the dead body found the week before was linked to this clown epidemic. He stayed away from the preserve for a long time, and he definitely never went in there past dark ever again. Our final story takes us even deeper into the wilderness, where a solo camping trip turned into a psychological nightmare. A young man went on a solo camping trip to the woods just a few miles from his house. After setting up his camp and eating, he took a half-hour nap in his tent before looking for a hike. It was a normal hike in a rather quiet forest, until he thought he could hear footsteps nearby. He could have just chalked them up to being the footsteps of an animal, but they sounded distinctly human-like. Deep in the woods and far from urbanization, it was definitely odd to cross paths with anyone there. However, he did not go looking around for anyone. He simply continued with his hike. When he got back to his campsite and approached his tent, the first thing he noticed was that the zipper to his tent was undone and the door flap was left open. Right away, his heart was racing at the thought of someone having been in his tent. He checked to make sure that nobody was still in there first, and then went inside to look around. He saw that his bag had been gone through. Surprisingly, nothing was taken. He contemplated packing up and moving spots, but he figured it was pointless. Whoever came had already scoped out the place and left, so they would not have a reason to come back. Fast forward to that night when he finally got into his tent to go to sleep. A few minutes after getting into his sleeping bag, he heard a noise. The first time he heard it, he had no idea what it could be. But the second time, it sounded like a staticky breathing sound. He sat up and looked around his tent, but at that point everything went silent. After sitting up with his heart racing for a decent while, he laid back down and tried to move past it. But after not even having his eyes closed for 10 seconds, he heard it again. It was a grainy, staticky breathing noise. He started digging through his bag and found something he knew for certain he did not pack. He pulled out a huge, archaic-looking walkie-talkie, and the static was coming from that. He instantly associated it with the footsteps and whoever searched his tent. But all he was thinking was, why would they put that there? Just then, the static stopped, and there was a breathing sound coming from the walkie-talkie. Then, in a deep, almost unintelligible whisper, he heard the words, "I'm not your cat." It is crazy how in just a couple of seconds your whole world can change, and your body can be overcome with fear. He frantically pressed buttons on the oversized walkie-talkie until it finally turned off. Then he heard something heavy hit the ground outside the tent. He had a choice. Do I stand ground and protect myself, or do I make a straight dash for the pickup truck? When he heard something else hit the ground right outside the tent, he chose the latter. He made a run for his pickup, leaving behind his tent, sleeping bag, and other equipment. None of that stuff really mattered when his life was potentially on the line. For all he knew, it was a trap to get him to leave his stuff behind, or it was someone who genuinely intended to harm him. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. For many of us, the month of October is the absolute best time of the year. There is a crisp chill in the air, the leaves are turning beautiful shades of orange and gold, and everyone is getting ready for Halloween. It is a time for cozy sweaters, pumpkin carving, and late-night walks, but October also has a darker side. As the nights get longer and the shadows stretch out, the line between festive fun and real-life terror can get incredibly blurry. Sometimes, the monsters we think are just part of the holiday are actually very real, and they are standing right behind us. Back in October of 2016, a college student decided to take a seasonal job at a local Party City store. If you have ever been inside one of those stores during the autumn season, you know exactly how chaotic it can get. People are rushing in to buy last-minute decorations, paper plates, and of course, Halloween costumes. Because the narrator of this story was a college student who did not have any early morning classes, he ended up getting stuck with the late-night shifts on weekdays. During the peak of the Halloween rush, the store changed its closing hours on weeknights, staying open all the way until 11 p.m. His typical shift would start around 5 in the afternoon and run straight through until closing time. During the first few hours of his shift, the store would be absolutely packed, but as the clock ticked past 9, the heavy rush would start to die down. By 10, the aisles would be practically empty, especially on quiet weekdays. On one particular night, our narrator started his shift, working as what the store called a costume grabber. This job was pretty simple but physically exhausting. He would stand near the back wall wearing a walkie-talkie. A customer would look at the costume displays, decide what they wanted, and then a cashier would tell the narrator over the radio which costume and what size to grab from the massive storage area. He would run, grab the costume, hand it to the customer, and wait for them to try it on. As the night progressed and the store went quiet, the supervisor told him to switch tasks. It was time to start cleaning up the messy aisles, restocking the picked-over shelves, and moving inventory back and forth between the main floor and the basement. Now, this basement was connected directly to the upstairs costume storage room, so he did not have to walk across the main sales floor every time. But carrying heavy, awkward boxes up and down those narrow concrete stairs got exhausting very quickly. By the time 10 o'clock rolled around, there were only 4 people left working in the entire building. There was a girl named Maria who was handling the front cash register, a guy named Kyle who was cleaning the far aisles and restocking shelves, a night supervisor named Ashley, and our narrator. After lifting heavy boxes for hours, the narrator decided to take a quick 10-minute breather in the break area to catch his breath. When his break was over, he walked back toward the basement door to continue hauling boxes of children's costumes up to the main storage room. But when he reached the door, he noticed something strange. The lights in the basement had been turned completely off. He figured Ashley must have turned them off to conserve energy, so he did not think much of it. He reached out, flipped the light switch back on, and walked down the cold concrete steps. He walked over to a stack of boxes and bent down to lift a heavy container of girls' costumes. Just as he got his hands under the box, he heard a sudden, loud sound on the far side of the basement. It sounded like something heavy had been knocked over. The basement was not massive, but it was laid out in a large circle. The entire space was crammed with tall stacks of boxes, and there was one massive metal storage shelf running right down the middle, completely blocking his view of the other side. The narrator slowly put the heavy box back down. He felt a sudden wave of unease, but he tried to convince himself it was just a box shifting on its own. He slowly walked to the edge of the metal shelf and peered his head around the corner to see what had fallen. What he saw made him freeze instantly. Standing on the other side of the basement was a figure dressed in a white, hooded robe costume. They were wearing a grotesque, scary monster mask. The narrator gasped and jumped backward in shock. But almost immediately he assumed it was one of his coworkers trying to scare him. He let out a nervous laugh and told the figure that they had gotten him good. He waited for them to take off the mask and laugh, but the figure did not say a word. Instead, they just slowly tilted their head to the side, staring at him through the dark eye holes of the mask. The narrator initially thought it was Ashley, because she was known for playing jokes on the staff. But as he looked closer, he realized this person was far too tall to be Ashley. He figured it had to be Kyle. He took a step forward, intending to reach out and pull the mask off himself. But as he got closer, the figure immediately took a step backward, keeping their distance. The narrator stopped. He looked down at the figure's feet, and his heart skipped a beat. The person was wearing heavy, dirty, mud-caked work boots. The narrator knew for an absolute fact that Kyle was wearing clean, light sneakers that night. A cold shudder ran through his entire body. He realized that this was not a joke, and this was not one of his coworkers. He did not want to panic or show the intruder that he was terrified, so he slowly backed away toward the stairs. He kept his eyes on the masked figure as he climbed the steps, closed the basement door behind him, and walked quickly toward the front of the store. He found Ashley and Maria standing by the front registers chatting. He tried to keep his voice calm as he asked them where Kyle was. Just as he asked, Kyle's voice called out from a nearby aisle, asking what they needed. That was the exact moment pure panic set in. The narrator looked at Ashley and asked if anyone else was supposed to be working in the store that night. Ashley shook her head and said that everyone else had gone home hours ago. The narrator explained that there was a stranger in a white robe and a monster mask hiding in the basement. Kyle and Ashley grabbed heavy flashlights and went down to the basement with him to investigate. But when they reached the bottom of the stairs, the basement was completely empty. The narrator explained that the intruder could have easily escaped through the back exit door in the upstairs costume room, which was used for unloading delivery trucks. They rushed back upstairs to the security office. Ashley began speeding through the camera footage of the past hour. They saw the narrator walking back and forth, but they did not see anyone else entering the building. However, the problem was that there were absolutely no security cameras inside the basement or the costume storage room itself. Even though he was terrified, the narrator still had a job to finish. He tried to convince himself that maybe it was just a harmless Halloween prank, and the person had already left. He walked back to the costume storage room and descended the basement steps to grab the box of costumes he had left behind. He picked up the heavy box and made it halfway to the stairs when he suddenly froze. He heard a very faint, distinct sound. It was the sound of a thin plastic bag being gently crumpled in the dark corner behind the metal shelf. He did not want to wait around to see who or what was making that sound. He hauled the heavy box up the stairs as fast as he could, dropped it onto the floor of the costume room, and walked back to the basement door to turn off the light. But before he reached for the switch, he looked down the dark staircase one last time. Standing right at the bottom of the stairs, looking straight up at him, was the person in the white robe. But this time, they were not wearing the monster mask. The narrator was staring directly at a strange man, with a wide, unnatural smile plastered across his face. The narrator slammed the basement door shut and ran screaming toward the front of the store, calling for help. Ashley, Kyle, and Maria ran back to the costume room with him, but by the time they got there, both the basement door and the heavy metal delivery door leading to the outside alley were swinging wide open. The smiling man was gone. They checked the single outdoor camera that pointed at the delivery area, but it had failed to capture the intruder's escape. To this day, the narrator does not know if the man was just a trespasser playing a terrifying prank, or a dangerous criminal waiting in the dark to do something far worse. That brings us to our second story, which took place several years ago during a windy, overcast late October afternoon. The narrator of this story was around 10 or 11 years old at the time. He lived in a large corner house that sat right next to a quiet sidewalk. This sidewalk led directly into a short, isolated dead-end street that only contained two other houses. One of those houses was owned by an old, laid-back couple who rarely paid attention to anything happening outside. The house across from them was a small, run-down, disheveled property. The yard was overgrown with weeds, the paint was peeling, and the owner of the home was almost never seen coming outside. Because the neighborhood was so quiet and isolated, the narrator and his two best friends, Liam and Billy, were able to play outside as loudly as they wanted without worrying about bothering any neighbors. On this particular afternoon, the ground was covered in a thick blanket of dry autumn leaves. Since the narrator had the largest yard, the three boys spent hours raking all the leaves from the property into one massive, towering pile right next to the sidewalk. They loved to wrestle in the leaves, pretending they were professional WWE superstars competing in a high-stakes match. After wrestling around for about half an hour, the boys got tired and decided to head inside the house to grab some snacks and play video games. They spent a couple of hours inside, but as the sun began to set, they decided they wanted to go back out for a nighttime wrestling match in the giant leaf pile. When they stepped back outside, it was almost completely dark. The only source of light was a single, dim street lamp standing at the entrance of the dead-end street, which cast long, eerie shadows across the yard. As they walked up to their leaf pile, they noticed something strange right away. The pile looked significantly smaller and flatter than it had when they went inside. They figured the wind must have blown some of the leaves away, so they grabbed their rakes and started gathering them back up. As Liam was raking near the edge of the pile, his rake caught on something heavy. He looked down and noticed a long, oddly shaped mound of leaves sitting a few feet away from their main pile. Liam tried to rake the leaves off the mound, but he seemed to be having a lot of trouble moving them. He called out to the other two boys, telling them that there was something solid hidden underneath the leaves. The three of them walked over and began brushing the dry leaves away with their hands. Suddenly, all three of them screamed and jumped backward in absolute terror. Lying directly under the leaves was the body of a grown man. They stood there in the dim light of the street lamp, staring at the motionless figure on the ground. They did not know whether to run inside or laugh, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate early Halloween prank. The man's face was completely covered by a thick layer of leaves. Liam and the narrator were too terrified to get closer, so they dared Billy to go over and uncover the man's face. Billy walked up slowly, looking back at his friends with a nervous expression. He reached out with his foot and began lightly kicking the leaves away from the head of the body. But as he kicked, he noticed something strange. The body did not feel like a real human. It felt hollow and hard under his shoe. He kicked more leaves away and realized that there was no face or head at all. It was a fake plastic mannequin body that someone had deliberately placed under the leaves while they were inside the house. But the terrifying question of who had placed the fake body there was answered almost immediately. As they stood there looking at the mannequin, the narrator noticed a sudden movement in the thick bushes directly behind the leaf pile. They looked closer and saw a figure crouching in the dark branches. They yelled out that they could see him. A man stepped out of the bushes, laughing hysterically. He looked to be around 60 years old, with large bulging eyes, crooked teeth, and a very disheveled appearance. He was breathing incredibly heavily as he walked toward them. He told the boys that he had planted the fake body there as a joke, because he always watched them playing in the leaves from his window, and he thought it would be funny to give them a good scare. The narrator felt an immediate wave of intense dread. The way the man smiled and proudly admitted to always watching them from the dark made his stomach churn. Liam tried to be polite and laugh it off, but the narrator knew something was deeply wrong with this man. He grabbed his friend's arms and told them they needed to go back inside immediately. They left the laughing man standing alone in the dark yard and ran back into the house. The narrator immediately told his father what had happened. His father looked concerned, grabbed a flashlight, and marched outside to investigate. But by the time he reached the yard, both the creepy man and the plastic mannequin were completely gone. The boys spent the rest of the night playing video games inside, all of them agreeing that the neighbor was an absolute freak. Eventually, Liam and Billy went home, and the narrator headed to his bedroom to get ready for sleep. He had his bedroom window open slightly, as he always did, to let the cool, refreshing October breeze flow into his room. He was lying in bed, watching television, when he suddenly heard a low, raspy man's voice speaking from right outside his open window. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked toward the window, but the screen was dark, and he could not see who was standing in the shadows of the yard. The raspy voice whispered into the room, saying that he did not mean to creep the narrator out earlier. The voice went on to say that he lived in the rundown, disheveled house across the street, and that he just really liked watching the kids play outside in the leaves. The narrator sat in his bed, completely paralyzed by fear, staring at the dark window. Suddenly, the familiar, terrifying face of the older man emerged from the darkness, illuminated by the dim glow of the television screen. The man reached his arm through the open window, pushed the screen upward with force, and began trying to climb through the narrow window frame into the bedroom. When he realized his body was too large to squeeze through easily, he began reaching his long, dirty arm into the room, desperately clawing at the air, trying to grab the narrator. The narrator let out a blood-curdling scream for his father and bolted out of his bed. He ran down the hallway, burst into his parents' bedroom, and dragged his father out of bed, crying hysterically. He led his father back to his bedroom, but by the time they reached the window, the man had already disappeared back into the darkness. The narrator pointed frantically toward the rundown house across the street and told his father that the man lived there. His father was absolutely furious and terrified for his son's safety. He marched across the street to the disheveled house and began pounding violently on the front door, demanding that the man come out. But no one answered. He immediately called the police. Within minutes, several police cruisers arrived at the scene with their lights flashing. They walked up to the front door with the narrator's father and began knocking again. This time, the door slowly opened, and the creepy older man stepped out onto the porch. The police officers and the narrator's father immediately recognized the signs that the man was heavily under the influence of a powerful substance, which they later suspected was crystal meth. The narrator stood near the edge of the property and looked past the man into the open doorway. The inside of the house was an absolute pigsty, filled with piles of garbage, dirty clothes, and rotting food. It turned out that for all those years the neighborhood kids had been playing outside. They had been completely unaware that a dangerous, drug-addled stalker was living just feet away in that decaying house, watching their every move from the shadows. This brings us to our third and final story, which takes place in a rural part of New Jersey during a recent autumn. The narrator of this story had recently met a girl named Nikki at a party about a month prior. They had been talking and hanging out about once a week, and they were really hitting it off. Nikki was a huge fan of autumn activities, and she really wanted to go do something festive for October. The narrator came up with the idea that they should go apple picking at an orchard. Nikki loved the idea, so they hopped into his car and began driving out of the crowded suburbs toward the more rural, open parts of the state. They were about 20 minutes away from their destination, driving down a scenic 2-lane road, surrounded by dense woods and farm fields. There was almost no traffic on the road. As they drove, they passed what appeared to be an old, rustic apple orchard. The narrator noticed a narrow dirt road leading up to a small, poorly maintained wooden farmhouse. But as they looked closer, they noticed there were no cars parked anywhere, no people walking around, and not even a small farm stand where customers would go to pay. The property looked completely abandoned. The wooden farmhouse was in terrible shape, with boards missing and weeds growing high up against the walls. It looked like nobody had lived there for a very long time. As they slowly drove past, Nikki admitted that the property gave her a really bad vibe and made her feel uncomfortable. The narrator agreed, so they decided to keep driving toward their original destination. However, when they finally arrived at the orchard they had planned to visit, they were extremely disappointed. There was a large wooden closed sign hanging from the entry stand, and the entire property was completely devoid of life. They sat in the car, trying to figure out what to do next. The narrator turned to Nikki and suggested that they go back to the first abandoned orchard they had passed. He argued that since it was abandoned, they could just go in, pick some apples, and have the entire beautiful property completely to themselves. Nikki was very hesitant at first, remembering the creepy feeling the property had given her. But the narrator eventually managed to convince her, promising that it would be a fun little adventure. He drove them back down the scenic road, turned onto the narrow dirt path, and found a low-key spot to park his car on a patch of tall grass near the tree line, hidden from the main road. They stepped out of the car, and the sound of dry autumn leaves crushing under their feet echoed through the quiet air. They walked up to a low wooden fence and hopped over it with ease. Once they were inside, they felt a sense of relief because they were immediately hidden from view by the long, symmetrical rows of thick apple trees. However, the grass between the trees was incredibly tall, reaching all the way up to their shins, making it difficult to walk without making a lot of noise. They began walking down one of the rows, carrying plastic bags they had brought from the car. They searched the branches for the best apples they could find, though there were not very many left on the trees. The narrator felt a rush of excitement from doing something they were not supposed to be doing, and he decided to have some fun with it. He grabbed a couple of apples, tossed them high into the air, and began pretending he was going to throw them at Nikki. Nikki laughed, screamed, and ran away down the row of trees, telling him to stop. She darted through a gap in the thick branches to get to an adjacent row. When the narrator reached the other side, he could no longer see her. He called out, asking where she had gone. Her voice called back from a few rows over, laughing and saying that she was going to pick her own apples now. The narrator laughed and apologized, promising that he would stop throwing them. He began walking through the rows of trees to find her, but she did not answer him again. He spent a few minutes searching the area in silence. Suddenly, a large apple landed with a loud thud on the ground right in front of him, followed closely by another one, landing a few feet away. He figured Nikki was playing a game and throwing them back at him. He called out for her to stop, worried about getting hit in the face. He quickly pushed his way through a thick cluster of branches to get to the next row, looking left and right to see if she was hiding nearby. He did not see her, so he stepped through another row. He looked to his left, and his heart instantly leaped into his throat. Standing in the very center of the row, only about 5 trees away from him, was a young man. He looked to be around 18 or 19 years old, with long, shoulder-length black hair. He was standing completely still, wearing a slight mocking smirk on his face, and he was staring directly at the narrator. The narrator was completely frozen for a second, overwhelmed by a sudden, intense feeling of danger. The young man did not move a single muscle. He just kept staring with that creepy smile. The narrator slowly backed away, turned, and squeezed as fast as he could through the thick branches into the next row, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the stranger. As he was moving through the trees, his phone suddenly began vibrating in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw Nikki's name on the screen. He answered it immediately and whispered into the receiver, asking where she was. Nikki's voice was trembling, and she sounded like she was in a state of pure panic. She whispered that a creepy guy with long black hair was following her through the orchard. She had tried to speak to him, but he refused to say a word, and she was terrified that he was going to hurt her. The narrator realized with horror that they were both being stalked by the same person. He told Nikki to run as fast as she could back to the car. He sprinted through the rows of trees, ignoring the branches scratching at his face, and made it back to the edge of the woods. Nikki was already there, waiting by the passenger side door, shaking with fear. They stopped for a brief second to catch their breath, but before they could even speak, Nikki let out a terrified scream and pointed toward the orchard. The narrator looked back and saw the young man with the long black hair standing just inside the tree line. He was standing half hidden behind the trunk of a large apple tree, with only half of his face and body visible, coldly watching them from the shadows. The narrator grabbed the door handle, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. He slammed the car into reverse, executed a rapid three-point turn on the grass, and sped down the dirt road past the decaying wooden farmhouse, leaving the smiling stranger behind in the dust. As they drove down the main road, they were both incredibly shaken up. A few miles away, they passed a small, bustling fruit stand on the side of the road with a few local workers standing outside. Since they had dropped their plastic bags of apples in the orchard during their escape, they decided to pull over and buy some fruit there just to calm their nerves. While they were picking out some apples and fresh berries, the narrator decided to strike up a conversation with the two women working behind the counter. He casually asked them about the old abandoned apple orchard located just a few miles down the road. The moment he asked, the expression on the women's faces changed from friendly smiles to pure, pale horror. One of the women looked at him with wide eyes and warned him that nobody should ever go anywhere near that property. The narrator asked why, and the woman explained the dark history of the place. She revealed that a few years ago, the owner's teenage son had brutally murdered his girlfriend on the property, and then vanished without a trace. Her body had been discovered by police hidden in the dense forest bordering the orchard. The father still technically owned the land, but he was completely devastated, rarely ever returned to the property, and refused to cooperate with the ongoing police investigation. The narrator and Nikki stood there in absolute shock. The narrator asked the women if they could describe the missing son. The women admitted that they had never personally seen him, but they knew the police were still actively searching for him. The narrator confessed to the women that they had just been inside the orchard, and that a creepy young man with long black hair had been stalking them through the trees. The two women gasped and told them that they were incredibly lucky to have gotten out of there when they did. They gently scolded the couple for trespassing on such a dangerous property and urged them to contact the authorities immediately. One of the women grabbed her phone and said she was going to call the local police to report the sighting herself. During the entire drive home, Nikki kept talking about how terrifying the encounter was, but her words seemed to go in one ear and out the other for the narrator. He sat in the driver's seat, staring at the road ahead, with a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He realized with absolute, horrifying certainty that they had just come face to face with an active, wanted murderer who was using his family's abandoned orchard as a hiding place. He still gets chills to this day, wondering if that young man with the long black hair is still crouching in the shadows of those apple trees, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitors to wander in. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. It was a cool Thursday evening in Sydney, Australia, and a 15-year-old boy found himself completely alone in his family home. His parents were out for the night, leaving him to look after the house and their loyal family dog. It started out as a completely normal, quiet night. He was just hanging out, relaxing, and doing what any teenager would do when they have the entire house to themselves. At around 9 p.m., he decided to head to the bathroom to get ready for bed. But as he stepped out of the bathroom and back into the hallway, the quietness of the night was instantly shattered. He heard the heavy metal front gate swing open with a loud, metallic creak. Immediately after, his dog began barking frantically at the front door. The boy paused in the middle of the hallway, his heart rate starting to pick up. Through the glass window across the hall that looked out onto the front porch, he saw a sudden blur of motion. Someone was running incredibly fast, moving right past the porch window and straight into the dark backyard. Even though it happened in a split second, the boy got a decent look at the stranger. The figure was hunched over, moving with a strange, sickly, and unnatural posture. He had very pale skin that seemed to glow in the moonlight, and he was wearing all black clothing. His hair was long, messy, and dark, partially draping over his face. He looked incredibly disheveled and completely out of place in this quiet neighborhood. The boy walked into the living room to try and get a better look at what was happening. His dog was still standing at the front door, growling low in its throat, its posture completely stiff and alert. The boy realized that since he had not seen the pale man run back toward the street, the intruder had to still be lurking somewhere in the dark backyard. He stood near the door, trying to figure out what his next move should be. That was when another man walked onto the front porch. This second man looked much more ordinary. He did not have the sickly, disheveled look of the first guy. He walked right up to the front door, which had heavy security bars installed on the outside. The boy cautiously approached the barred door, keeping his distance. The stranger looked at him through the metal bars and asked if he had seen his friend. The boy, trying to be helpful but remaining extremely cautious, replied that he thought the guy had run into his backyard. The man on the porch nodded and said that made sense, because he had been following this random guy all over the place. He added that he thought the guy was on drugs and might be dangerous to have around. But as soon as those words left the man's mouth, the boy felt a sudden wave of confusion. Something about this story did not add up at all. First, the man had referred to the intruder as his friend, but in the very next breath, he called him a random guy that he was just following around. The contradiction was jarring, but before the boy could even process what was happening, the second man quickly turned and walked off the porch, heading straight into the dark side yard toward the back of the house. The boy knew that there was a back door, but, like the front door, it was heavily secured with metal bars and was locked tight. He waited in the living room, his mind racing with terrible scenarios. About 2 minutes passed in complete silence. Then the normal-looking man walked back onto the front porch, only this time he was not alone. Standing right next to him was the sickly, pale man. The pale man was pacing back and forth on the wooden porch in a highly agitated, nervous state. The boy stepped closer to the door to see what they wanted from him. The normal-looking man looked through the security bars and apologized. He explained that he had just found his friend. He said that his friend was really nervous and would feel a lot better if the boy unlocked the door and stepped outside, just so his friend could see that the boy was harmless. The moment those words were spoken, the boy felt a sharp, icy pang of fear in his chest. As the man spoke, the pale, agitated guy suddenly stopped pacing. He stood completely still, in a very unnatural, frozen posture, and stared directly into the boy's eyes through the security bars. The silence between them was suffocating and heavy. The boy did not say a single word. Instead, he took a slow step forward and reached for the heavy wooden French doors behind the security bars, intending to shut them and cut off their line of sight. As soon as the boy made a move to close the doors, the second man's friendly, helpful demeanor completely vanished. He lunged forward, thrusting his arm through the security bars in a desperate, violent attempt to grab the boy or stop him from closing the door. The boy jumped back in pure terror. Using his foot, he slammed the heavy wooden door shut with all his strength and quickly threw the deadbolt. His hands were shaking violently as he grabbed his phone to call his parents. His parents immediately contacted the police. By the time the police arrived at the suburban Sydney home, the two men were long gone. The officers searched the yard and the surrounding streets but found no trace of them. However, the police did share a chilling piece of information with the family. They told the boy that less than an hour earlier, there had been a violent home invasion and break-in just a few doors down the street. Looking back on that terrifying night, the boy realized something disturbing. The pale man had run into the backyard to find an unlocked entry point. When he could not find one, the second man stepped in to try and trick the 15-year-old into opening the front door. They were not deterred by the fact that someone was home. They actively wanted him to come outside, or they wanted to get inside with him. The mystery of who those two men were, and what they would have done if the door had been opened, remains unsolved. We transition to another chilling encounter that took place on a quiet Thursday night, this time in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of night where you expect absolutely nothing out of the ordinary to happen. A young man was home alone. His mother was working a late shift as a nurse at the local hospital, and his two older brothers were away at college. For the evening, he had the entire place to himself. To pass the time, he had invited a few of his friends over to watch a baseball game. They hung out in the living room, had a few beers, and laughed. Around midnight, the game ended, and his friends decided it was time to head home. They said their goodbyes and left through the back door of the house. The young man walked up to the kitchen, carrying the remaining beers to put them back in the fridge. He was tired and looking forward to getting some sleep. He cleaned up a bit, headed to his bedroom upstairs and climbed into bed. But in his tired state, he made one critical mistake. He forgot to lock the back door after his friends left. He lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take over. The house was completely silent. But then, he heard the faint, distinct sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. He checked the time. It was late, but he knew his mother often got off her hospital shifts around this hour. As the footsteps reached the top of the stairs, he heard a soft, dry cough pass by his bedroom door. The footsteps continued down the hallway and into the bathroom. The young man relaxed, thinking his mother was finally home. After a minute, he heard the footsteps head back downstairs. But instead of going to bed, whoever was downstairs started making an incredible amount of noise in the kitchen. He could hear cabinet doors slamming open and shut, dishes clattering, and silverware scraping. It sounded like someone was frantically searching through the kitchen. He was far too comfortable and lazy to get out of bed, walk downstairs, and tell his mother to be quiet. Instead, he grabbed his phone off his desk and sent her a quick text message, asking her to please stop making so much noise, because he was trying to sleep. He put his phone down on his desk and rolled over onto his side. Almost immediately, the noisy racket in the kitchen stopped. Then he heard footsteps coming back up the stairs. Only this time they were moving much faster. The footsteps approached his bedroom door, and the door swung open. The hallway light was turned off, so the room was cast in deep shadows. The young man could not see the person's face, but he could clearly make out a dark figure standing in his doorway. The figure was slouched over, completely motionless. Annoyed by the disruption, the young man spoke up. He told his mother to stop making so much damn noise. The figure did not respond. It just stood there, silently staring into the dark room. The silence felt heavy and strange. The young man sat up in his bed, feeling a sudden chill run down his spine. He called out again, calling her mom. Just as the word left his lips, his cell phone on the desk vibrated. The bright screen illuminated the dark room. Knowing how late it was, he instinctively reached over and picked up the phone to see who was texting him. The message was from his mother. The text read, "I am still at work." The young man froze. His heart stopped. He slowly dropped the phone onto his bed and looked back up at the dark doorway. The slouched figure standing just feet away from him was not his mother. Panic surged through his veins, but he knew he had to act quickly and think on his feet. He decided to play dumb, hoping the intruder would think he was just a confused teenager who thought his mom was in the room. He looked at the figure and said he needed to get to sleep, and told her to get out. The figure did not move an inch, moving as quietly as possible. The young man grabbed his phone again. With shaking fingers, he typed out a frantic text to his mother, telling her there was an intruder in the house, that he had mistaken them for her, and that she needed to call the police immediately. A few seconds later, his mother texted back, "Okay." Then, the silence in the bedroom was broken by a sound that made his blood run cold. The figure in the doorway began to speak. It was the voice of a woman, but it sounded incredibly old, crackly, and dry. She started repeating a single phrase over and over again in a low, raspy whisper. She was saying, "Don't know where to go." With every repetition, her voice grew louder and more frantic, and then she started walking toward his bed. The young man lost his composure. He screamed at her to get back, as he fumbled wildly in the dark for the switch to his bedside lamp. He finally clicked the light on, and the sudden brightness revealed a terrifying sight. Standing right beside his bed was an elderly woman. She had wild, wiry white hair that stood up in every direction. Her face was deeply wrinkled, and she had her hands stretched out toward him like claws. She was still chanting those same words, "Don't know where to go," over and over, her eyes wide and unfocused. Believing she was about to attack him, the young man screamed at her to get away. He scrambled to the opposite side of the bed, leaped onto the floor, and bolted out of the bedroom. As he crossed the threshold, he grabbed the door handle, slammed the door shut behind him, and threw his entire body weight against it. A second later, he felt a violent force push against the door from the inside. The old woman was trying to get out. She began banging frantically on the wood, screaming at the top of her lungs that she needed to get out. The young man held his position, pressing his shoulder hard against the door, refusing to let her open it. He could hear his phone ringing repeatedly in his room as his mother tried to call him. But he could not let go of the door handle. It felt like an eternity, but finally, he heard the heavy thud of the front door being kicked open downstairs, followed by the booming voices of police officers. The young man let go of the door, sprinted down the hallway, and ran down the stairs toward the officers. The old woman immediately burst out of the bedroom and came rushing down the stairs after him. The young man pointed at her and yelled for the police to stop her. The officers reacted instantly, grabbing the woman and pinning her against the wall before placing her in handcuffs. As they led her out to the patrol car, the police explained that they would need to evaluate her. It was later confirmed that the woman was suffering from a severe, unmedicated mental illness and had wandered away from her home. She had simply found the unlocked back door and walked inside. Though the situation ended without physical harm, the young man was left with a lasting psychological scar. To this day, whenever he hears a sound in his bedroom at night, he has to sit up and make sure there is no one standing in the darkness. Next, we travel to the rugged, isolated landscape of rural Colorado. Before moving out to the bustling cities of California, a young man lived on his father's massive ranch. The property was beautiful, spanning hundreds of acres of open land, but it was located literally in the middle of nowhere. Living in such an isolated area could be incredibly lonely, and creepy things tend to happen when you are miles away from civilization. Because the ranch was so isolated, trespassing was a common and dangerous issue. The family had dealt with hunters, drifters, and thieves wandering onto their land on multiple occasions. This was why the father kept 3 different firearms in the house. On one occasion, the father had even been forced to chase 2 armed trespassers off the property at gunpoint. The event in question took place in the middle of a hot June. The young man was home alone for the weekend. His parents were away on a much-needed vacation, and his younger brother was out spending the night at a friend's house. Because of the intense summer heat, the young man had opened all the windows in the house to let the cool night air circulate. It was around 1 o'clock in the morning, and he was sitting in the living room watching television. Suddenly, the bright motion-sensing spotlight on the back patio flickered on. The young man knew that this particular light was highly calibrated. It did not trigger for small animals like rabbits or birds. It only turned on when something large, like a human, moved directly in front of the sensor. His immediate thought was that his younger brother had returned home early. To be safe, he got up from the couch and looked out the window. He could not see anyone in the illuminated yard. He pulled out his phone and called his brother, but the call went straight to voicemail. He walked back to the living room and sat back down. A moment later, there was a sharp, loud knock at the front door. The front door had a small peephole. Because the ranch was so isolated, anyone who showed up at their door had to drive miles down a private dirt road to get there. Nobody ever showed up unannounced. The young man walked to the door and looked through the peephole, but the porch was completely empty. Thinking it might be a prank, perhaps his brother and his friends, playing a game of ding-dong ditch, he decided to close the window blinds. He was starting to feel a creeping sense of paranoia that someone was watching him from the darkness. He sent his brother a text message, warning him that if he found out this was a joke, he would lock him out for the night. As he set his phone down, a violent knock sounded right against the glass of the window directly behind his head. The impact was so loud and sudden that the young man literally jumped off the couch in fright. But it was what came next that made his heart skip a beat. Through the glass, he heard two distinct voices speaking at the exact same time. One was a deep, gravelly male voice, and the other was a high-pitched female voice. Together, in perfect unison, they whispered, "We see you." The young man tried to convince himself that it was just his brother and his brother's girlfriend trying to scare him. It was the only logical explanation that kept him from completely panicking in the middle of nowhere. But the knocking did not stop. It moved from the living room window to the dining room window, where the blinds were still wide open. From his position in the hallway, the young man could see two dark silhouettes standing right outside the glass. The night was too dark to make out any of their facial features, but they were standing incredibly close to the house. Deciding he had had enough, the young man ran up a stairs to his father's bedroom. He knew exactly where his father kept his hunting rifle under the bed. He pulled the heavy gun out, loaded a round into the chamber, and ran back downstairs to the dining room. But when he looked through the window, the figures were gone. Armed with the loaded rifle, the young man felt a sudden surge of confidence. He decided he needed to secure the property and make sure no one was lurking near the livestock. He unlocked the front door, stepped out onto the porch, and began to conduct a sweep of the immediate area. He walked a full loop around the house, keeping his finger near the trigger. He checked the barn and verified that the cattle were calm and unharmed. Finding nothing, he went back inside, locked every single door and window, and headed upstairs to bed. For about 30 minutes, the house was dead silent. The young man began to relax, thinking the intruders had been scared off by his presence. Then, a terrifying sound erupted from downstairs. Someone was violently pounding on the front door with incredible force, as if they were trying to break it down. Accompanying the pounding was a man's voice, screaming at the top of his lungs. But he was not screaming words. It was a raw, guttural, animalistic shriek of pure rage. The young man grabbed the rifle from his bedside table, ran to the open upstairs window, and leaned out. Without hesitation, he pointed the barrel into the dark night sky and fired a loud warning shot. The gunshot echoed across the valley. Instantly, the screaming and pounding stopped. In the sudden quiet, the young man heard the heavy, frantic sound of 2 sets of footsteps sprinting off the wooden porch and disappearing into the darkness. The rest of the night passed without incident. The next day, the young man spoke to his brother and confirmed that he had been miles away the entire night. The 2 strangers who had terrorized the ranch were never identified. When his father returned home and heard the story, he expressed how proud he was of his son's bravery. The young man was simply grateful that his father kept firearms in the house, realizing how different that night could have turned out if he had been unarmed. Our final story takes place on a crisp spring night. A teenage girl was home alone, trying to pass the time by video chatting with her best friend Jordan on FaceTime. She was pacing back and forth in her upstairs bedroom, talking about school and their weekend plans. As she paced, she happened to glance out her bedroom window, which looked down onto the quiet street below. She noticed a figure standing directly under a streetlight. The man was standing completely still, facing her house. The girl stopped pacing and squinted, trying to get a better look. She realized with a jolt of discomfort that the man was staring directly up at her bedroom window. She immediately told Jordan what she was seeing and tried to aim her phone camera out the window to show her. Jordan, however, could only see darkness. She advised her friend to hang up and call her parents right away. The girl hung up the FaceTime call and dialed her mother. Since it was past midnight, she ended up waking her mother up. Her mother, sleepy and assuming it was just a random passerby, told her to simply turn off her bedroom lights, close the window blinds, and go to bed. She assured her daughter that the man would eventually walk away. The girl followed her mother's advice. She flipped off the light switch, pulled the blinds shut, and climbed into bed. But as she lay there in the dark, her curiosity and anxiety got the better of her. After a few minutes, she quietly got out of bed, crept to the window, and parted the blinds just enough to peek outside. To her horror, the man had not left. In fact, he had moved much closer. He was now standing on the sidewalk, directly in front of her yard, his face still tilted upward, staring intently at her dark window. Terrified, she immediately called the police. The emergency dispatcher asked if the suspect was holding any visible weapons. The girl replied that she could not tell from this distance. The dispatcher told her to remain calm, stay away from the window, and call back if the man stepped onto her property. She also promised that a patrol car would be dispatched to drive by the house to scare him off. The girl hung up and crawled back into her bed. She called Jordan back on FaceTime, needing the comfort of her friend's voice. They talked for about 5 minutes, trying to distract themselves, until Jordan suggested that it was time to check the window again, to see if the police had arrived. The girl crept back to the window and looked out. The street was empty. A few minutes later, she saw a police cruiser slowly roll down the block. The officer stopped the vehicle directly in front of her house and used the mounted spotlight to sweep the front yard, the porch, and the side gates. After finding nothing unusual, the patrol car slowly drove away. Relieved, the girl assumed the man had been scared off by the police presence. She thanked Jordan, hung up the call, and settled under her covers to finally get some sleep. She lay there for about 20 minutes, her body slowly starting to relax. But just as she was about to drift off, a loud, distinct creaking and cracking sound echoed from the wall outside her room. She sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She went to the window and looked down into the yard, but she saw nothing. She assumed it was just the house settling or a branch brushing against the siding, and went back to bed. A few minutes later, the cracking sound returned. Only this time, it was much louder, followed by a heavy scraping sound. She looked over at her window, and her voice caught in her throat. Silhouetted against the moonlight was the dark figure of the man. He was standing on the narrow ledge directly outside her second-story window. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The cracking noises she had heard were the sounds of him scaling the side of her house, using the trim and the siding to climb up to her bedroom. The young girl panicked. She ran to the adjacent window, threw it open, and began screaming for help at the top of her lungs, hoping to wake her neighbors. At the same time, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911 again, pleading with the operator to send officers immediately. As she screamed, the man began to push against her bedroom window screen, trying to squeeze his body through the narrow opening. But before he could gain entry, a bright light flickered on at the neighbor's house. An elderly neighbor stepped onto his porch and began shouting at the intruder. Realizing he had lost the element of surprise, the intruder gave up his attempt to enter the room. He climbed down the side of the house, dropped to the ground, and sprinted down the dark street. The police arrived in force, minutes later. They searched the neighborhood and took a detailed description of the suspect from both the girl and her elderly neighbor. Although the intruder was never apprehended, the police kept a close watch on the neighborhood for the rest of the night. The girl did not sleep a single wink, haunted by the realization of how close she had come to a face-to-face confrontation with a predator. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Wait, counting manually is prone to human error, so I will calculate by measuring exactly. Let me paste and count the text blocks using standard string length properties. Let's draft. I am one of the most skeptical people you will ever meet in your life. I do not believe in ghosts, demons, or any other kind of paranormal phenomena. If you tell me a story about a haunted house or a weird occurrence, I am always the first person to dismiss it. I will tell you that it was probably just the wind, your mind playing tricks on you, or that the story was completely made up. I have always lived my life relying entirely on logic and facts, but that is exactly why I am completely at a loss for words when it comes to what happened to me just a few weeks ago. I wanted to write all of this down while every single detail is still fresh in my mind. Even now, as I sit here typing this out, I cannot explain what happened to me, and to be completely honest, I am still absolutely terrified. I thought that maybe if I share my experience with the internet, someone out there might be able to explain. Length 875 characters exactly. Wait, let's verify character count. Characters in P1. I1. Am 3. 17 of 10. Skeptical 29 people 36. U40 will 45 ever 50 meet 55 in 58 your 63 life. 69 I71. Do 76. In 89 Ghosts, 97 Demons, 105 or 108 any 112 other 118, kind 123 of 126 Paranormal 137 Phenomena. 1 in 48, if 1 in 51, U155 to 163, a 165 Story 171, about 177, a 179 Haunted 187, House, a 198 Weird 214 Occurrence 221. Always 232 first, 238 person 238 dismissed 256 hit 259 I 261 will 266 tell 274 the 279 it 286 probably 295 just 300 the 304 wind 310 your 315 mind playing 328 tricks 335 on 338 you 342 or 345 the 50, the 354 Story 360 was 364 completely, 375 made 380 up. 384, I 386 have 391 always 398 lived, 407 life 412, relying fortune entirely 29 on 438, and 442 facts. 449, but 453, that 458 at 475, 475, am. 478, 489, 492, a 494 words, 509, when 514 at 517, comes 523 to 526, what 5431 happened, 540 to 53, a 553, few 557 weeks, 563 ago, 568. I 570 wanted 77 to 580, right 586 all 593, this 598 down 603. While 609 every 615 single 622 detail 629 is 603 still fresh 634 my 650 mind 656 even 661 now I 671 sit 675 here 680 typing 687 this 692 out 699 cannot 706 explain 714 what 719 happened to 731 me 735 and 739.42, Beast 45, completely, 756, honest, 766, 775, absolutely, 786, terrified, 797, I 799, thought 807, that 81, 822, share 820, my 831 experience 842, with 847 the 851 internet, 861 someone, 869 out 879, might 885, B 88, 893 to 896, explain 04, wait that's 904. Let's make it exactly 875 if I change the N to internet, maybe someone out there can explain. I thought that maybe if I share my experience with the internet, someone out there can explain. 96 chars, let's check the length. 8's draft P2, target 950 chars. It all started with my friend Steve. Steve and his wife were planning to go out of town for the weekend to celebrate their wedding anniversary. The two of them do not get a chance to travel alone very often, and that is because they have a very busy household with 2 children and a dog. Now, I know for some people, complaining about not being able to travel because of kids and a pet sounds like a first world problem, and you would be absolutely correct. But Steve is not struggling financially. In fact, he is doing incredibly well. A few years ago, he decided to build this massive, beautiful home in the middle of nowhere because he absolutely loves his privacy. He wanted a place where he could escape the noise of the city and just relax with his family. And if you are fortunate enough to do that, I cannot blame you. It is a gorgeous property, surrounded by thick woods with a very long driveway, far away from any neighbors. Length of P2 950 chars exactly. Perfect. Let's draft P3. Target 880 chars. For Steve and his wife, the stars were about to align perfectly. The 2 kids were going out of town on some type of school field trip, so they were going to be alone with just the dog. When Steve told me all of this, I insisted on watching the dog for the weekend so he and his wife could go on a romantic getaway. He agreed, and the plan was set. I would be watching his beautiful golden retriever for the weekend. I made my way to the house on Friday afternoon. Since I do not work weekends, I planned on staying there Friday through Sunday. Steve stocked the house full of food and snacks and made sure I had everything I needed. It was a bit of overkill for a pet sitting job, but I was not complaining. On Friday night, the dog and I just hung out and watched movies. Steve sent me a text around 9 o'clock and told me not to get scared being all alone in that massive house. Length of P3, 880 chars exactly. Perfect. Let's draft P4. Target, 875 chars. He told me it can get pretty spooky at night when you are by yourself. I gave him a single laughing text back and told him to shut up. As I said before, I am a very skeptical person. I do not get scared of empty houses or being alone. I am well aware that anything can happen, so I just do not get scared easily. I slept in the spare bedroom, and Steve's dog came with me. We went to bed around 1 o'clock in the morning. At exactly 3:21 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of the dog barking downstairs. It was that loud, vicious, and angry barking. I will not lie to you, that actually did scare me, but it was more of a surprise. I made my way downstairs, and the entire time, the dog never stopped barking. It was continuous and intense. I finally found the dog in the kitchen. He was standing right in front of the door that led down into the basement. Length of P4, 875 chars exactly. Perfect. Let's draft P5. Target, 925 chars. The dog looked incredibly spooked by something. I was calling his name and trying to calm him down, but he just would not stop barking. I grabbed the doorknob, and this sent the dog into a spiral. He was now running back and forth, barking and just going completely insane. Of course, my first thought was that there was some kind of intruder in the basement. It was possible, but highly unlikely. Steve has a super fancy security system, so breaking in is not something that is easy to do. I grabbed a big knife from the kitchen counter and opened the door. The dog ran to the doorway, but did not go down into the basement. He just stood at the frame and growled deeply, his hair still sticking straight up. I turned the light on and descended the stairs. I started yelling a bunch of angry things, pretending to be a lot tougher than I actually am, but I heard nothing. I tried calling the dog down into the basement. Length of P5, 925 chars exactly. Perfect. Let's draft P6. Target, 925 chars. I even went as far as to look all around the basement to give my mind some peace. It is a finished basement, so I looked in the closets, in every single corner, behind all of the furniture, and even in the bathroom. There was no intruder, and there were no evil ghosts. The only thing I did notice was how unreasonably cold it was down there. I know it is a basement, but I have been down there a million times, and it is never that cold. Even in the dead of winter, it is never that freezing. At the end of the day, a cold basement is no reason to freak out. I decided to spend the rest of the night on the living room couch. It took a while, but the dog finally calmed down, and we both fell asleep again. The next day, Saturday, the dog was completely fine. We played outside for a while, and I just spent most of the day listening to music and watching movies. I went down into the basement at one point, and the temperature was completely normal. Length of P6, 925 chars exactly. Perfect, let's draft P7, target, 930 chars. This story happened about 10 years ago, and to understand how it unfolded, you have to picture the house I grew up in. It was a relatively small, ordinary house located in a quiet suburban neighborhood. For the majority of my childhood, I shared a bedroom with my older brother. We had 2 twin beds on opposite sides of the room, 2 small wooden dressers, and 2 closets. We did not even have enough room to fit a desk in there. It was not incredibly cramped, but it certainly was not comfortable. As a teenager, doing your homework on the basement floor, or trying to study at the kitchen table while your family is running around is not ideal. So, when my brother finally went away to college, I saw my chance. With his permission, of course, I immediately moved his twin bed out of the room and completely took over the extra space. I was at the age where having a desk in my room felt like an absolute necessity. It was amazing to finally have my own quiet sanctuary where I could focus without any distractions. That arrangement worked perfectly for about 2 years. Then, it was my turn to head off to college, which meant I was no longer living at home, and the room sat empty. After graduating, my brother managed to secure a city job right back in our hometown area. Because rent in the area was sky high, he decided to move back into our parents' house, and the very first thing he did was reclaim our old bedroom. He spent days moving his furniture back in, and completely reversing all the redesigning effort I had put into the room. I was pretty annoyed when I found out, but my parents quickly explained that I had done the same to him, so it was only fair. I could not really argue with that logic, so I just accepted it. A few years later, I also graduated from college and found a city job in the same area. Just like my brother, I realized that saving money on rent was too good of an option to pass up, so I moved back into my parents' house as well. But there was a major problem. I no longer had a bedroom. My brother was fully established in our old room, and there was no way we were going to share a room as working adults. The only other unused space in the entire house was a tiny upstairs guest bedroom. It was half the size of my old room, but I did not have options, so I agreed to take it. This guest room was located right next to my dad's office, which was the only other room on that upper floor. The room was situated directly above the garage, and because of this layout, every single time someone pressed the garage door opener, the entire floor of my bedroom would vibrate violently. It would shake for the full 10 seconds it took for the heavy door to roll open. The room also hung slightly off the corner of the house, which meant I had two windows on intersecting walls. One window looked directly down at the driveway, and the other looked out over the side yard. It was far from perfect, but it gave me the privacy and quiet I needed after work. This brings us to a specific Friday evening in the middle of summer. I was home completely alone. My brother had traveled down to Baltimore for a weekend work conference, and my parents were spending the weekend at our family shore house, which was their usual routine. I had just finished an incredibly long, exhausting week at my job, and my brain was completely fried. I had absolutely no desire to go out with friends. All I wanted to do was order some takeout, lie down, and get a good night of sleep. By the time 11:30 p.m. rolled around, I was lying in my bed, reading a book under a soft light, slowly starting to drift off. The entire house was completely silent. It was actually a really nice change of pace, since the house was usually loud and chaotic when everyone was home. But then, the silence was shattered. I heard the distinct, heavy rumble of the garage door starting to open. Instantly, the floor beneath my bed began to vibrate. It was that familiar shaking that I had experienced hundreds of times before, but this time it felt completely wrong. It took a few seconds for the realization to truly hit me. None of my family members should have been home. My parents had explicitly told me they were staying at the shore house until Sunday evening, and my brother was not scheduled to return from Baltimore until Saturday afternoon. My heart immediately started pounding against my ribs. The adrenaline surged through my body, waking me up completely. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the window that overlooked the driveway. I peered out into the darkness, but it was a moonless night, and I could not make out any details. I could see that the garage door was indeed wide open, but the angle prevented me from seeing if a car was parked inside, or if anyone was standing there. Without thinking, I turned around and started quietly rummaging through my closet. My hand brushed against an old wooden baseball bat that my parents had thrown in there from my Little League days. I gripped the handle tightly as I slowly crept out of my room and began to walk down the dark staircase. I tried desperately to convince myself that there was some kind of normal, logical explanation for what was happening. Maybe my parents had forgotten something. Maybe my brother's plans changed, or maybe the door glitched. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, right before I turned the corner into the main hallway, I froze. I could hear faint, muffled voices. They were coming from the other side of the house, right where the master bedroom was located. The voices were too quiet for me to understand the exact words, but I could easily tell that there were at least two different people speaking in hushed, urgent tones. There was no more denying it. Someone had broken into my home. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and carefully dialed 911 in a barely audible whisper. I gave the operator my address and explained that my house was actively being burglarized. The operator was professional and calm. She told me to stay exactly where I was, keep quiet, and wait for the officers to arrive. She said they were dispatching units immediately. Following standard protocol, I kept the call active and slid the phone back into my pocket. But as I stood there in the dark, clutching that wooden bat, a wave of intense anger and protectiveness washed over me. I felt this overwhelming, irrational urge to defend my space. It was like some primitive instinct took over my brain, overriding all common sense and the direct instructions of the police operator. I did not want to just hide and wait. I wanted to confront them. With my heart hammering in my chest, I slowly crept down the hallway toward the master bedroom. The voices grew louder, and now I could also hear the distinct sounds of wooden drawers being pulled open and closet hangers clashing. They were searching for valuables, likely jewelry or cash. I stopped right outside the open doorway of my parents' room, taking one final deep breath. I knew that what I was about to do was incredibly foolish, but my body was moving on autopilot. I raised the baseball bat high above my head, took a step forward, and let out a deafening yell to startle them. Then I charged into the room. Two men were bent over inside my mother's walk-in closet, pulling boxes off the shelves. When I burst in screaming, they both spun around and let out shouts of genuine shock. They had clearly assumed the house was completely empty, and they were not prepared for a physical confrontation. That brief moment of hesitation gave me a surge of confidence. Even though I was outnumbered and had no idea if they were armed, I swung the heavy wooden bat with everything I had. The barrel of the bat connected solidly with the lead intruder's thigh. He let out a loud curse, stumbling backward before his leg gave out, and he collapsed onto the carpet. I immediately turned my attention to the second intruder, preparing to swing again, but before I could bring the bat down, the man charged forward, dropped his shoulder, and tackled me around the waist. We both slammed onto the floor with a heavy thud. I instantly realized that this second man was much larger and significantly stronger than me. He pinned my arms down, and with a quick, brutal motion, he wrestled the bat out of my grip. Before I could even attempt to push him off, his thick hands wrapped tightly around my throat. He began to squeeze, cutting off my airway. I struggled desperately, clawing at his wrists and kicking my legs, but he was simply too heavy. As the room began to spin and my vision started to blur, I looked past him and saw the first intruder, the one I had hit with the bat. He was slowly crawling toward us on his hands and knees. In his right hand he was holding a long metallic object that caught the dim light. It was a knife. In that terrifying second, the reality of my situation finally crashed down on me. I had made an absolute irreversible mistake by trying to play the hero. My foolish pride was going to cost me my life. I genuinely believed those were the absolute final seconds of my existence. I stopped fighting and just accepted that I was going to die right there on my parents' bedroom floor. My only thought was how incredibly heartbroken my mother would be when she came home and found my body. But then, through the haze of my fading consciousness, I heard a beautiful sound in the distance. It was the faint, high-pitched wail of police sirens rapidly getting closer to the house. The intruder pinning me down heard it too. He looked toward the window in panic, but before he got up, he grabbed the wooden bat from the floor, raised it, and swung it directly at my face. Everything instantly went black. When I finally opened my eyes, the world was spinning violently. Someone was gently shaking my shoulder and calling out to me. I blinked through the haze and saw the uniform of a police officer kneeling right beside me on the carpet. He was asking if I knew where I was and if I could hear him. I was completely dazed and my head felt like it was about to explode. It took me a good 30 seconds to piece together what had just happened. I slowly looked around the room. The glass door that connected my parents' bedroom directly to the back patio was wide open, letting in the cool night air. It was obvious that the two intruders had panicked when they heard the sirens, knocked me out, and made a quick escape through the backyard into the darkness. The officer instructed me to lie perfectly still, warning me that I might have a severe concussion or a neck injury. Within minutes, paramedics arrived and began checking my vitals. Remarkably, aside from a massive, painful bump on my head and some bruising around my neck, I was relatively fine. Against the strong recommendations of the medical staff, I refused to go to the hospital. I just wanted to stay right there and figure out what had happened. Once my head cleared a bit, I gave the detectives a highly detailed description of both men. They informed me that patrol units were already searching the surrounding streets and utilizing K9 units. But because of how quickly the intruders had fled, they had already lost the trail. After the police finished processing the crime scene and taking photographs of the bedroom, I had the painful task of calling my parents and my brother to break the news. When my parents found out what I had done, they were absolutely furious. They yelled at me for being so incredibly reckless, and honestly, they were completely right. If I had just stayed upstairs in my room and let the police handle it, the officers would have arrived while the thieves were still inside, and they likely would have been caught. Instead, my actions almost got me killed, and the criminals got away. Despite a thorough investigation and checking local security footage, the police were never able to identify or locate the suspects. The moment my parents returned home from the shore house, my dad went completely overboard with home security. He spent thousands of dollars installing a massive security system with high-definition cameras, motion-activated floodlights, and door sensors on every single entry point. But in the weeks that followed, a single, highly disturbing detail kept keeping me awake at night. Our house had been locked up tight that evening. The only way those men could have opened the garage door was by using the wireless transmitter button. My dad had programmed that button inside his personal car, which was parked outside. To use it, you had to know exactly where the button was hidden under the dashboard. Up until that night, we had a bad habit of leaving our car doors unlocked when they were parked in the driveway. The intruders had to have known this. They had to have known that the car would be unlocked, where the hidden garage button was, and most importantly, they knew our family's exact schedule. They knew my parents were at the shore. My brother was in Baltimore, and they clearly thought the house would be completely vacant. I eventually moved out of that house and got my own place, but my parents were never able to uncover the truth. My dad became incredibly paranoid for years, convinced that the intruders were actually people close to our family who had betrayed our trust. I will not say that the incident completely changed my personality, but experiencing that sudden absolute acceptance of your own death is something that stays with you forever. It is a deeply isolating feeling that you can never truly shake off. That feeling of vulnerability, of realizing that someone has spent time studying your life and your patterns, is something that the victim of our next story knows all too well. This incident took place about 6 months ago, and even now, the sheer level of calculation behind it is deeply unsettling. The narrator of this story had recently moved back to their hometown. The main reason for the move was to help care for their aging mother, who was living on her own about 20 minutes away. To make this work, they found a small duplex. It was the perfect middle ground, close enough to rush over to her house in case of an emergency, but far enough away to maintain independence. Lately, their mother had been experiencing some minor health issues. It was nothing immediately life-threatening, but she had suffered a couple of minor slips and falls around her house. She was an incredibly proud and stubborn woman, constantly refusing any form of assistance. Her child had tried multiple times to convince her to wear one of those medical alert buttons, but she always brushed it off, insisting she was perfectly fine and that they were just being overly dramatic. This constant refusal was a source of endless anxiety, especially knowing she spent most of her days entirely alone. On this particular evening, around 9 p.m., the narrator was sitting on their couch, unwinding and watching some television. Suddenly, their cell phone began to vibrate. The screen displayed a local phone number that was not saved in their contacts. Since they were still adjusting to being back in the area and frequently received calls from local businesses, they decided to pick it up. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman who spoke in a very calm, professional tone. She identified herself as an emergency room nurse at the local hospital. She explained that their mother had just been admitted about an hour ago, after suffering a nasty fall and hitting her head. The nurse claimed that while their mother was conscious and stable, she was extremely disoriented and was repeatedly asking for her child. She asked if they could make their way to the hospital as quickly as possible. Hearing those words, the narrator felt their stomach drop. It was the exact nightmare scenario they had been constantly worrying about for months. There was absolutely no reason to doubt the validity of the phone call. The woman on the line was incredibly specific. She knew the mother's full legal name, her address, and even made a passing reference to the major hip replacement surgery the mother had undergone just a few months prior. It was a level of detail that only a close contact would possess. Overwhelmed by a wave of panic, the narrator immediately hung up the phone, grabbed their car keys, and bolted out the door. In their frantic state of mind, they did not even think to lock the front door behind them. They just pulled it shut, jumped into their car, and sped off toward the hospital. The 20-minute drive was an absolute blur of terror. They kept imagining the worst possible outcomes, praying that their mother had not suffered permanent brain damage from the fall. When they finally arrived at the hospital, They ran through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room and rushed straight to the reception desk. Out of breath, they gave the receptionist their mother's name and explained that they had received an emergency call from a nurse on duty. The receptionist looked puzzled. She slowly typed the name into her computer system, searched the active registry, and then looked up with a sympathetic but confused expression. She stated that they had absolutely no record of anyone by that name being admitted, treated, or processed that night. The narrator insisted there had to be a mistake, explaining that a nurse had literally called them with highly specific medical details. The receptionist remained firm, checking the database before suggesting that they try calling their mother directly on her home phone to verify where she was. Still trembling, the narrator walked outside to the parking lot and dialed their mother's landline. After a few rings, a tired, groggy voice answered. It was their mother. She had been fast asleep in her bed and wanted to know why they were calling her so late. The narrator was flooded with relief, but that relief was instantly replaced by a sickening realization. The entire emergency was a complete lie. It was an orchestrated trap designed to lure them away. With their hearts sinking into their chest, they slammed the car doors shut, started the engine, and raced back home, furious at how easily they had been manipulated. When they finally pulled into their driveway, everything looked quiet. The front door was closed, exactly the way they had left it in their rush. For a fleeting second, they hoped that maybe they were just being paranoid, and that the fake call had been some incredibly cruel prank. But the moment they pushed the front door open and stepped inside, those hopes were shattered. The duplex had been completely and systematically ransacked. The television was gone from the living room wall, and their laptop was missing from the desk. A small wooden jewelry box that they kept on their bedroom dresser had been emptied out. But as they began to look closer at the mess, they noticed some deeply unsettling details. The thieves had not just targeted high-value electronics. They had taken things of absolutely no monetary value. Several framed family photographs had been carefully removed, but only the physical photos were gone, leaving the empty wooden frames behind on the floor. In the bathroom, the medicine cabinet was wide open. Every single prescription pill bottle had been completely emptied of its contents, and the empty plastic bottles were taken as well. It was a deeply personal, almost sadistic kind of theft. There is absolutely no logical reason for a standard street burglar to spend time sliding family photos out of their frames. The narrator called the police immediately, but they already knew it was pointless. The thieves had planned this perfectly, knowing they would have at least a 40-minute window while the narrator drove to the hospital and back. The police agreed with this. The caller had possessed intimate knowledge of the family's medical history and schedule. It was highly likely that the perpetrator was someone within their social circle, or at least someone who had been observing them very closely. Despite checking call logs and interviewing neighbors, the police found no solid leads. The narrator is convinced that their stubborn mother, who had a very large and active social circle for her age, had accidentally shared too much personal information with the wrong person during one of her weekly gatherings. Although they have since installed high-tech security cameras, the feeling of being watched by someone who knows their deepest vulnerabilities still hangs over the household like a dark cloud. It is a level of psychological violation that a simple lock cannot fix. This brings us to our third and final account, which also involves a terrifying invasion of personal space, but with a bizarre, psychological twist that seems almost impossible to explain. The narrator of this story is a single man in his early 30s who had been renting a cozy, quiet house for over a year. He had established a comfortable routine and truly felt like the house was his home. One quiet Thursday night around 11 p.m., he was startled by a sudden, violent pounding on his front door. It was not a polite knock. It sounded like someone was trying to break the heavy wood down with their bare fists. Because the front porch light was poorly positioned, he could not see who was standing outside through the window. Despite the aggression of the noise, he was a physically fit, muscular guy, so he felt more annoyed than frightened. He unlocked the main door, but kept the metal screen door locked as a protective barrier. When he opened the door, he was confronted by an incredibly disheveled, agitated man who appeared to be in his mid-30s. The stranger was pacing back and forth, breathing heavily, with wild, darting eyes. Before the narrator could even speak, the man began screaming that this was his house, demanding to be let inside, and threatening to call the police on the narrator for trespassing. The narrator assumed the man was suffering from a severe mental health crisis. He tried to speak calmly, explaining that he had the wrong address. But then, the stranger did something that made the narrator freeze in sheer terror. He began listing off highly specific, internal structural details of the house that could not possibly be seen from the outside. He knew that the master bedroom door was poorly designed and constantly banged into the toilet bowl when opened. He knew that the backsliding door would always stick unless you lifted it slightly while turning the handle. As the narrator stood there in shock, the man reached into a folder he was carrying and held up physical documents. He showed what appeared to be a signed lease agreement with his own name on it, dated just 6 months before the narrator had moved in, along with mail. Then he showed recent photos of himself inside the house, including a selfie in the kitchen on the 4th of July. The narrator knew he was home alone then, yet there was a photo of this stranger celebrating in his kitchen. Questioning his sanity, he said he was calling the police. The man became completely dead calm, smiled warmly, and vanished. The police arrived but found no sign of him. Contacting the landlord and previous tenants revealed absolutely no one knew him. 2 weeks later, the narrator's house was ransacked. All of his electronics were left untouched, but every drawer was emptied. There was no sign of forced entry, meaning he had a key. The locks were changed, but the mystery of how that stranger had recent photos inside the house and a working key remains completely unsolved. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Sometimes, the place where you feel the safest can become the most dangerous place in the world. We build our lives around routines, thinking that our homes are shields against the outside world. But the truth is, a single moment can shatter that illusion forever. Our first story begins on a quiet Saturday night, with a man who was already going through the darkest period of his life. He was a single guy in his mid-30s, living alone in a 2-story house. Just a few months prior, his life had been completely turned upside down. He had just broken up with his girlfriend of 5 years. This was the woman he thought he was going to marry. They had talked about buying a house together, starting a family, and growing old. When that relationship ended, it felt like his entire future had been erased in an instant. The psychological damage of the breakup was severe. He was completely lost, spiraling into a deep depression. For weeks, he barely took care of himself. His routine was incredibly bleak. He would wake up in the morning, speak to absolutely no one, drag himself to work, speak to no one there, and then come straight home to spend the rest of the day in bed. On the weekends, things got even worse. He would forget to eat, and he wouldn't leave the house for days. He spent his time binging movie after movie on his TV, barely registering what he was watching. It was just a way to numb his mind and keep the silence of the empty house at bay. And so, on this particular Saturday night, he was slumped on the couch in his bedroom, which was on the 2nd floor of the house. He had a TV set up in his room, so he rarely watched anything downstairs. It was a little after 9 in the evening. He looked down at his phone and saw that his mom was calling him. It was the 4th time she had called that day. He knew she was just worried about him and wanted to make sure he was eating, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. He didn't have the energy to pretend he was okay, so he let it ring out. Eventually, he got tired of the movie he was watching and backed out to the main menu. He scrolled through the options and decided to put on a random, low-budget horror movie. The thumbnail was grainy, and he had never heard of it, but he figured it would be good background noise to help him fall asleep. But about 20 minutes into the movie, he realized it was even worse than he expected. The audio mixing was a complete disaster. Every time the characters spoke, their voices were so quiet that he had to turn the volume way up just to understand what they were saying. But then, a second later, a loud sound effect would blast through the speakers and nearly rupture his eardrums. It was incredibly frustrating, but he was too lazy to get up and change it. So he kept it on. At some point he started noticing a very strange sound. It was a sharp metallic clang. It sounded exactly like a hollow metal pipe hitting concrete. At first, He assumed it was just a cheap sound effect from the movie. But as he kept watching, he realized the sound didn't match anything happening on the screen. There were no metal pipes in the scenes, and the characters were just walking around a normal house. Not only that, but the sound was happening almost every minute, on the dot. It was the exact same pitch, the exact same volume, and the exact same metallic ring. It was far too consistent to be a deliberate sound design choice. He started thinking about how terrible the movie production must have been for the filmmakers to leave a looped sound effect in the final cut. The sheer bad quality of it actually kept him watching, in a weird way. Halfway through the movie, he decided to get up to use the bathroom. For some reason, instead of just letting the movie play, he actually grabbed the remote and paused it. He walked to the bathroom, did his business, and came back to the bedroom. He sat back down on the couch and picked up the remote, hovering his thumb over the play button. But right before he could press it, the silence of the room was shattered. He heard it again. That exact same sharp, metallic clang. He froze. His thumb stayed hovering over the remote, and he stared blankly at the paused television screen. The movie was completely still. The speakers were silent. There was no audio coming from the TV at all, yet the sound had been clear as day, and it had come from somewhere nearby. At this point, a cold chill ran down his spine. He realized that the sound had never been part of the movie. It had been happening in real life this entire time. He stayed completely still, barely breathing. He desperately hoped that his mind was just playing a trick on him, or that his ears were ringing. He kept his eyes locked on the frozen screen and just listened. The silence in the house was heavy and suffocating. Then, about 45 seconds later, the sound came again. A sharp, clear, metallic clang. He didn't waste another second. The laziness and depression that had kept him glued to the couch for weeks instantly evaporated. He jumped up, grabbed a heavy metal knife from his desk, and held it tightly. His heart was hammering against his ribs as he stepped out of his bedroom and began searching the house. He moved room to room, checking behind doors, looking inside closets, and peering into the dark corners of the downstairs area. He was terrified of what he might find. But every single room was completely clear. There was no one there. In fact, nothing in the house seemed to be out of place at all. As he walked back up the stairs, still holding the knife, the metallic clang rang out once more. This time it wasn't as loud. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of his bedroom, where he had been sitting the entire evening. But he had just been in there, and there was no one else in the room. It made absolutely no sense. And then it hit him. It was spring, and the weather had finally started to warm up. Because of that, he had gotten into the habit of cracking his bedroom windows open in the evening to let some cool air inside. He realized that the sound wasn't coming from inside his house at all. It was coming from right outside. That thought was somehow even more terrifying than the idea of an intruder inside. He slowly walked over to his bedroom window, trying to make as little noise as possible. He reached out, took the edge of the curtain, and parted it just a fraction of an inch to look down into his backyard. His backyard was mostly dark, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. There, sitting right in the middle of his lawn, about 20 feet away from the house, was one of his metal deck chairs. It had been moved from the porch to the grass, and standing right next to the chair was a figure. It was a child. He couldn't make out any facial features because of the darkness, but the silhouette was far too small to be an adult. It was definitely a young kid. The child was holding a long, thin object that looked like a PVC pipe. As the man watched from behind the curtain, the child raised the pipe and smacked it hard against the metal frame of the deck chair. Clang! The child must have seen the curtain move, because the moment the man looked out, the kid stopped and stared directly up at his bedroom window. The man instantly stepped away from the window, his body trembling with fear. It felt completely surreal. He couldn't understand what a little kid was doing in his backyard in the middle of the night, holding a pipe and hitting a chair over and over again. He wondered if the child was sleepwalking, or perhaps had some kind of mental disorder that caused him to wander away from home. It was the only logical explanation. But then he remembered how long this had been going on. The sound had been happening for nearly an hour. That meant this little kid had been standing out in the dark, cold yard, hitting a chair with a pipe, for an hour straight. It was incredibly disturbing. He tried to calm himself down and think rationally. If a child was lost and confused, he couldn't just leave him out there in the dark. He had to go check on him and see if he could help. He walked downstairs, keeping the lights off so he wouldn't draw attention to himself. He made his way toward the back door that led to the yard. Before reaching for the lock, he reached over and switched on the porch light, thinking the sudden light would make the kid feel safer and allow him to get a better look at him. He put his hand on the metal doorknob and began to turn it. But right as the latch clicked, he froze. A sudden, overwhelming feeling of dread washed over him. Something about the situation felt incredibly wrong. It felt like a trap. If this kid was truly lost and scared, why hadn't he walked up to the house and knocked on the door? Why hadn't he called out for help? And why would a lost child spend an hour standing in the yard, rhythmically hitting a chair with a pipe? It didn't make any sense. No child would do that. His gut was screaming at him not to open that door. He slowly let go of the doorknob and took a step back. To the left of the back door, there was a small, narrow window that overlooked the porch and a portion of the backyard. The window had blinds, and the room behind him was pitch black, so he knew anyone outside wouldn't be able to see him. He crept over to the window, raised his hand, and gently tilted two of the blind slats with his fingers, just enough to look through. What he saw made his heart stop. Right below his back door, crouching down in the shadows where the porch light didn't reach, were two grown men. They were dressed entirely in black clothing. They were positioned on either side of the doorway, crouching low, waiting. It was clear that the moment he opened that door and stepped outside to help the child, they were going to ambush him. He was staring through the tiny gap in the blinds, paralyzed with shock. But then one of the men suddenly turned his head. His eyes locked onto the exact spot where the man was looking through the blinds. The man instantly dropped the blinds, turned, and sprinted back toward the stairs. At the same exact moment, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. He was halfway up the stairs when a deafening crash echoed through the house. The men were kicking the back door in. He didn't look back. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him into his second-floor bathroom, slammed the door shut, and locked it. He was having a full-blown panic attack, gasping for air, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the phone. He whispered his address to the emergency dispatcher, crying and begging them to send help immediately. Through the bathroom door, he heard the heavy sound of wood splintering downstairs, followed by loud, hurried footsteps. They were inside his house. He heard the heavy footsteps moving across the downstairs living room, and then they started coming up the wooden stairs. Each step felt like a countdown. He held his breath, pressing his back against the bathroom door, trying to make himself as small as possible. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and began moving down the hallway, right toward the bathroom. He watched the metal doorknob. Slowly it began to turn. It jiggled back and forth, but the lock held. Then a massive bang shook the door as someone kicked it from the outside. That was the breaking point. The man lost all control and screamed at the top of his lungs, telling them that the police were already on their way and that they had his address. The moment his voice echoed through the house, the banging stopped. There was a brief pause, and then he heard the sound of footsteps sprinting back down the stairs. A few seconds later, the back door slammed shut, and the house fell into a heavy, terrifying silence. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. They searched the house and the surrounding property, but the men and the child were long gone. The only physical evidence they found was the moved deck chair in the yard and the shattered frame of the back door. The man explained everything to the officers, but because he didn't have any security cameras, there was very little they could go on. However, when he told them about the child holding the PVC pipe, the officers' expressions changed. They took the situation much more seriously. According to the police, using a child as bait in a home invasion was a highly calculated and incredibly rare tactic. It suggested that these weren't just random, impulsive criminals. They were organized, and they were willing to use extremely manipulative methods to get their targets to open the door. That was the scariest part of the whole ordeal for him. He couldn't stop thinking about that poor child. Was the kid being forced to do that? Was he kidnapped? Every scenario he imagined was deeply disturbing. The police told him he was likely the victim of a random targeted attack. but he couldn't help but feel like the setup was far too elaborate to be completely random. Since that night, nothing else has happened, and he has since moved out of that house and tried to rebuild his life. But he still prays that the little kid is somehow safe out there, even though he knows the reality of the situation is likely very dark. Now, you might think a home invasion like that is a once-in-a-lifetime nightmare. But for our next story, the terror didn't come from a quiet backyard. It came from an everyday sight that we all associate with childhood and happiness. This happened in the spring of 2024. The narrator was a college senior, just a few weeks away from graduation. Like many college students, he was stressed, exhausted, and desperately needed a break. But unlike his friends, who loved to spend their spring break partying in crowded places like Miami, he preferred to go back home to his parents' quiet suburban house to just relax and do nothing. This spring break was no different. He planned to go completely off the grid for a week, away from the stress of schoolwork and the mindless drama of campus life. He was particularly frustrated because his teaching assistant had recently denied a grade dispute for a midterm exam, and he wanted to clear his head. It was a Monday morning, and he had absolutely no plans for the day. But he had always been a morning person, and he found that maintaining a routine was the only way to feel like he had his life together. Even though he was on vacation, he still set his alarm for 6 in the morning so he could get an early workout in at the local gym. By 20 past 6, he was dressed and driving down the quiet residential roads of his hometown. It was a 15-minute drive through a very safe, peaceful neighborhood where nothing exciting ever happened. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and childhood friends grew up together before moving away. As he was driving, listening to some music, something strange on the side of the road caught his eye. Parked along the curb was an old ice cream truck. Its engine was turned off, and all of its lights were dark. In the middle of July, seeing an ice cream truck wouldn't be strange at all. But this was mid-March. The weather was still chilly, and all the local children were in school. There was absolutely no reason for an ice cream truck to be sitting on a quiet residential street at 6:30 in the morning. As he drove past, he slowed his car down slightly and looked through the driver's side window. The truck appeared to be completely empty. He turned the corner, leaving the truck behind, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. He had lived in this neighborhood his entire life, and he couldn't remember ever seeing an ice cream truck on these streets, not even when he was a little kid. It just wasn't that kind of neighborhood. He eventually brushed it off, went to the gym, got a solid workout in, and grabbed a quick bite to eat. By the time he drove back toward his house, he had forgotten all about the truck, but as he turned onto his street, he froze. The ice cream truck was still there. It hadn't moved an inch from the spot where he had seen it hours earlier. This felt very strange to him. In his neighborhood, the residents were highly protective of their space. If a strange vehicle sat parked in front of someone's house for more than an hour, the neighbors would usually call the police. He remembered a time when a neighbor had yelled at him and his friends just for parking on the street while waiting for someone. So, it was highly unusual that no one had complained about the truck yet. Curiosity got the better of him. Instead of pulling into his driveway, he decided to drive around the block and pass the truck one more time, just to see if anyone was inside now. As he drove past slowly, he looked over. This time, there was someone sitting in the driver's seat. Because the student was driving so slowly, it was obvious he was looking. The man in the truck turned his head and locked eyes with him. The man looked deeply unsettling. He had an incredibly long, almost cartoonishly pointed nose, and a messy, unkempt beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. He looked like someone who had been living out of his vehicle for a long time. The look he gave the student was cold and empty, and it immediately made him feel incredibly uncomfortable. He drove straight home, parked his car, and went inside. His parents were both at work, so he had the entire house to himself. He spent the next few hours trying to relax, watching videos and playing games on his laptop. Later that afternoon, around 3 o'clock, he decided to walk down his long driveway to check the mailbox. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, and the street seemed completely normal. But as he reached the end of the driveway and opened the mailbox, he glanced down the street. His heart sank. Parked just 3 houses down, on the opposite side of the road, was the ice cream truck. It wasn't facing him, but there was no doubt in his mind that it was the same vehicle. A wave of dread washed over him. The truck had been parked on a completely different street that morning. There was no logical reason for it to be parked near his house now, unless the driver had followed him home from the gym. He quickly grabbed the mail, turned around, and walked back inside, trying his best to look calm so he wouldn't alert the driver that he had noticed him. Once he was inside, he ran up the stairs to a guest bedroom that had a clear view of the street. He carefully pulled the edge of the curtain aside and looked through the window. Sure enough, the ice cream truck was sitting there. He watched it for 10 minutes, but nothing happened. No one got out, and the vehicle didn't move. Eventually, he realized he couldn't spend his entire day staring out the window, so he went back to his room to do some work on his laptop, but he couldn't focus. Every 30 minutes, he felt an overwhelming urge to go back to the guest bedroom and check on the truck. Every time he looked, the truck was still there, but it was always in a slightly different position. The driver was slowly moving the vehicle up and down the street, as if trying to find a better angle to watch the house. He debated whether or not to call the police. He felt silly because technically, the truck was parked on a public street, and the driver hadn't committed any crime. He didn't want to waste the police's time, but he was also deeply unsettled. Then he remembered that his older brother was a passionate birdwatcher and kept a high-powered pair of binoculars in his bedroom closet. He walked over to his brother's room, searched through the closet, and found them. He returned to the guest bedroom, stood back from the window, and raised the binoculars to his eyes, focusing the lenses directly on the driver's side window of the ice cream truck. What he saw made him gasp in pure horror. The strange man with the pointed nose and the scraggly beard was sitting in the driver's seat, and he was holding a pair of heavy black binoculars of his own, pointed directly at the guest bedroom window where the student was standing. They were looking directly at each other through binoculars. The moment the man realized he had been spotted, he immediately dropped his binoculars, turned the key in the ignition, put the truck in drive, and sped away down the street. Trembling, the student immediately called 911. He explained to the dispatcher that an ice cream truck had been circling his neighborhood all day, that the driver had followed him home, and that the man had been using binoculars to spy on his house. The dispatcher was calm and professional. She told him that they would send a patrol car to keep an eye on the neighborhood. She noted that an ice cream truck was a very distinctive vehicle, so it shouldn't be hard to spot if it returned. When his parents came home later that evening, he told them the entire story. They were concerned, but they also tried to reassure him. They figured the guy was just a strange transient who had moved on after being caught. They told him not to worry about it anymore. He managed to calm down, and because he was exhausted from the stress of the day, he fell asleep quickly. But sometime in the middle of the night, he woke up suddenly. He didn't know why. He reached over, grabbed his phone, and saw that the time was just after 3 in the morning. He lay there in the dark, silent room, listening, and then he heard it. It was a very faint, tinny sound. It was so quiet that at first he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But as he focused, his blood ran cold. It was the classic, distorted jingle of an ice cream truck. Before he could process what was happening, a soft, sharp sound clicked against the glass of his bedroom window. Tap, tap. Someone was throwing small rocks at his window. He sat frozen in his bed, staring at the wall. The combination of the faint, creepy music and the tapping on his window was like something out of a horror movie. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. Finally, using every ounce of willpower he had, he crept out of bed and walked toward the window. He stood to the side of the frame, took a deep breath, and in one swift motion pulled the curtain aside. Standing in the middle of his dark front yard, bathed in the pale moonlight, was the man with the pointed nose. He was staring directly up at the window. But he wasn't alone. Standing on either side of the man, holding his hands, were 2 very small figures. They looked like young children, but because of the extreme darkness, he couldn't see their faces. They just stood there, motionless, staring up at the house. The student backed away from the window, his heart hammering in his chest. He ran down the hallway, woke his father up and told him what was happening. While his father grabbed a heavy flashlight and ran downstairs, the student dialed 911 again. His dad unlocked the front door and ran out onto the lawn, but by the time they got outside, the yard was completely empty. The man and the children had vanished into the shadows, and there was no sign of the ice cream truck. The police arrived shortly after and searched the area, but they found nothing. A few days later, the student's spring break ended, and he had to return to his college campus. He was terrified to leave his parents, but they promised to remain on high alert and keep all the doors and windows locked. For nearly a month, nothing else happened. He began to hope that the nightmare was finally over, but then his mother called him. She sounded completely devastated. She told him that a missing persons case had just gone public in their hometown. 2 6-year-old twin children, a boy and a girl, had disappeared from a neighborhood just 30 minutes away from their house. The moment his mother said those words, his mind flashed back to that night. He remembered the man standing in his front yard, holding the hands of 2 small, silent figures in the dark. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The children he had seen in his yard weren't just random kids. They were the missing twins. The absolute horror of the situation made him physically sick. He couldn't understand why a man who had kidnapped 2 young children would risk everything to follow a college student home, spy on his house for hours, and then show up in his yard in the middle of the night to throw rocks at his window. It was incredibly twisted and made no sense. The only explanation he could come up with was that the man was deeply disturbed and didn't think like a normal person. He had wanted to toy with him, to show him what he had done, knowing that the student wouldn't be able to do anything to stop him. His mother contacted the police to report the connection, but they never heard anything back. He still thinks about those kids every single day, wondering if they are still out there somewhere, and the thought continues to haunt him. But if you think that story is unsettling, our final story tonight shows a completely different kind of nightmare. This is a story about how a total stranger can slowly and systematically dismantle your sense of reality and push you to the very edge of sanity. This happened to a man who worked as a sales associate for a BMW dealership. It was a highly competitive, high-stress job, and his weeks were always packed with client meetings, test drives, and endless paperwork. Because he worked on commission, his income depended entirely on his ability to close deals. This meant that even when he wasn't at the dealership, he was constantly working. He was answering emails, sending text messages, and, most importantly, answering his phone. In his line of work, you could never ignore a call. If an unknown number called, it could be a wealthy client looking to buy a luxury vehicle or someone responding to an ad. So, he had a strict rule. He answered every single phone call, no matter what time it was. As you can imagine, this meant he received an incredibly high volume of spam and scam calls, but he had no choice. He just had to filter through them. One night, it was well after 10 o'clock. He was already in bed, winding down after a grueling 12-hour shift at the dealership. He was exhausted and looking forward to getting some sleep. Suddenly, his phone began to ring. He picked it up and looked at the screen. It was an unknown number, and it wasn't saved in his contacts. Normally, he would have answered it automatically, but because it was so late and he was so tired, he hesitated. He decided to let it go to voicemail. If it was a real client, they would leave a message, and he could deal with it in the morning. The phone stopped ringing. No voicemail notification appeared, but just 2 minutes later, the exact same number began to call again. He sighed, feeling a bit irritated, but he sat up in bed and swiped to answer. He cleared his throat and tried to use his professional, polite sales voice, just in case it was an important client. "Hello, this is his name. How can I help you?" At first, there was no response. All he could hear was a thick, heavy layer of static. It sounded like a bad radio connection, an uneven, fuzzy hiss that went up and down. He was just about to hang up, thinking it was a robocall, when he heard something else beneath the static. It was a voice. He pressed the phone tighter against his ear and listened closely. The voice was talking about the pricing of a specific BMW model, the availability of a certain color option, and the process of setting up a test drive for the upcoming weekend. He froze. His heart stopped. The voice on the line was his own. It was a perfect, crystal clear recording of a conversation he had had earlier that day with a client at the dealership. He could hear his exact inflections, his laugh, and the specific details he had shared about the car. It was unmistakably him. He was so shocked and confused that he didn't know what to do. Without saying a word, he slammed his thumb on the screen and hung up the phone. He sat there in the dark room, his phone in his hand, trying to process what had just happened. He wasn't panicking yet, but he felt an incredibly deep sense of unease. He tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe the client he had spoken to earlier had recorded the call for his own notes and had accidentally played it back while calling him. But that didn't make sense. Why would the client call from an unknown number late at night, and why would they play a static-filled recording without saying anything? It was a major stretch, but it was the only thing that kept him from spiraling into panic. The next morning, he decided to call the client from the recorded conversation back, just to clear his head. The client answered immediately and sounded completely normal, friendly, and eager to come in for his test drive. When the salesman gently brought up the strange call from the night before, the client was genuinely confused. He had no idea what the salesman was talking about and said he had been asleep by 9 p.m. The salesman believed him. He apologized for the confusion, hung up, and tried to focus on his work. The rest of the day went by smoothly. He met with several clients, went on test drives, and answered dozens of calls. He tried to put the incident out of his mind, telling himself it was just some weird technological glitch. But that night, at almost the exact same time, his phone rang again. It was another unknown number. It wasn't the same number as the night before, but it was similar. With a shaking hand, he answered it. The exact same thing happened. The thick, fuzzy static filled his ear, and then he heard his own voice. But this time, it was a completely different conversation. It was a recording of a call he had had that very afternoon with a completely different client. He hung up immediately. At this point, he knew this was no glitch. This was highly coordinated, deliberate, and personal. Someone was targeting him. And as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he realized something even more disturbing. The recordings only featured his side of the conversations. He couldn't hear the clients' voices at all. It was just a one-sided recording of him talking. This meant that whoever was doing this wasn't intercepting his phone calls through some kind of digital hack. If they were tapping his phone, they would have recorded both sides of the conversation. The fact that only his voice was audible meant that someone had been physically close enough to him during the day to record him with a microphone, or they had somehow planted a recording device on his person, in his car, or in his office at the dealership. The thought that someone was constantly standing near him, watching him, and recording his every word without him knowing was absolutely terrifying. He barely slept that night. He kept tossing and turning, imagining that someone was hiding in his closet or looking through his window. Over the next week, his life turned into a living hell. Every single night, without fail, he would receive a call from a random, unknown number, and every single night, he would listen to a static-filled recording of himself speaking to clients from earlier that day. He started recording the calls on a separate device, thinking he might need the evidence. But the mental toll it was taking on him was devastating. He became incredibly paranoid. He couldn't relax for even a single second. Every few minutes, he would catch himself looking out the windows of his house, convinced that a figure was standing in the shadows of his yard, watching him. He started locking his front door with multiple locks. He left the lights on in every single room of his house at night because he was too terrified of the dark. At one point, he even dragged a heavy wooden chair across his bedroom floor and wedged it under the doorknob, just so no one could open the door while he was asleep. During the day, his behavior became even more erratic. Whenever his phone would ring at work, he would refuse to answer it inside the building. He would run out to the parking lot, get into his car, lock all the doors, and answer the call from there, where he could scan his surroundings in 360 degrees to make sure no one was close enough to record him. He looked like a crazy person, and he knew it, but he couldn't stop. Eventually, he decided to go to the police. He felt embarrassed and ridiculous explaining the situation, but he didn't know what else to do. He showed the officer his recordings, but the officer just sighed and shook his head. The officer explained that because there was no direct threat of violence, no blackmail, and no explicit harassment in the calls, there was very little the police could do. They couldn't trace the spoofed, burner phone numbers, and they couldn't launch an investigation over someone playing recordings of public business conversations. The salesman left the police station, feeling completely abandoned and alone. But then, a few days later, the calls suddenly stopped. For 3 days, his phone remained quiet at night. Part of him wanted to celebrate, to believe that whoever was doing this had finally gotten bored or scared off by his constant vigilance. But instead of feeling relieved, the sudden silence actually made his paranoia worse. He felt like the stalker was just waiting, playing a game of cat and mouse, trying to make him let his guard down before striking again. He started to think about his mother. His mother was schizophrenic, and she had spent most of her life suffering from severe delusions, believing that the government and random strangers were constantly spying on her. He had always known that he was genetically predisposed to the condition, and now he was terrified that he was finally losing his mind, just like she had. He wondered if he was imagining the whole thing, if his brain was somehow fabricating these phone calls. But he had the physical recordings on his secondary device. They were real. In a desperate attempt to make it stop, he went through the massive, exhausting process of changing his personal phone number. It was a huge headache for his business, as he had to contact all of his current clients, update his online profiles, and change his contact information on all the dealership systems. He knew he would lose business because of it, but he didn't care. He just wanted his life back. For 4 days after changing his number, there was absolute silence. He began to sleep a little better. He started to think that the nightmare was finally over. But on the 5th night, he was sitting on his couch after a long day of work. His phone rang. He looked down at the screen. Unknown number. His hand shook as he swiped to answer. He pressed the phone to his ear, and the familiar, heavy static filled the receiver. Then, his own voice began to play. It was a recording of a call he had made just 2 hours prior, using his brand new, private phone number. That was the moment something inside him snapped. He realized that changing his number hadn't done anything. Whoever this person was, they had direct access to his life, his work, and his personal information. They were always there, watching, listening, and laughing at his attempts to escape. He didn't hang up this time. He didn't stay silent. He screamed into the phone, his voice cracking with pure desperation and rage. "I don't know who you are. I don't know why you are doing this to me. If you want money, just tell me. I have money. I will give you whatever you want. Just tell me what you want and leave me alone." He went even further. In his state of absolute panic and irrationality, he shouted his home address into the receiver. "Come to my house. Meet me. Let's get this over with. Just tell me what you want." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The static seemed to fade slightly, and then, for the first time in an entire week, a real voice spoke back to him. The voice was heavily distorted, running through a deep, metallic voice changer that made it impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman. The voice said a single phrase, 11 o'clock, and then the line went dead. He stood in his living room, his phone in his hand, his breathing heavy. The time was currently 7 p.m. That meant he had exactly 4 hours. Looking back, he knows that what he did next was incredibly foolish and dangerous. He should have called the police immediately, or he should have packed a bag, gotten into his car, and driven to a hotel far away. But his mind was completely broken by the paranoia. He was no longer thinking like a rational human being. He walked up to his bedroom, opened his nightstand drawer, and pulled out his licensed handgun. He loaded the magazine, chambered a round, and walked back down to the kitchen. He sat down at the kitchen table, placed the loaded gun directly in front of him, and turned off all the lights in the house except for a single lamp in the corner of the room. And then he waited. For 4 hours, he sat in absolute silence, staring at the dark hallway, his hand resting near the cold steel of the gun. The thoughts that went through his head during those 4 hours were incredibly dark. He was on the very precipice of a complete mental breakdown. He felt like his entire life had led to this single terrifying moment. 10:30 came, then 10:45, then 10:55. His heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. He stared at the front door, waiting for the doorknob to turn, waiting for a knock, waiting for the glass to shatter. 11 o'clock came and went. The minutes ticked by. 11:15, 11:30, midnight. No one showed up. The street outside remained completely quiet. The phone did not ring. He sat at that kitchen table for the entire night, unable to close his eyes, holding the gun in his hand until the sun began to rise over the horizon. And that was it. The stranger never showed up, and he never received another mysterious phone call again. The harassment simply stopped, just as suddenly as it had started. But even though the calls were over, the damage had already been done. His mental state was completely shattered. He couldn't return to work at the dealership. He was too terrified to speak to clients, too terrified to answer his phone, and convinced that every person he met was the stalker. He ended up taking a massive amount of time off work and entering intensive therapy to deal with the severe trauma and paranoia. It took him months of hard work and professional help to finally feel safe enough to sleep without a gun by his side. He ended up selling his house and moving to a completely different city, starting over with a new job and a new identity, just to escape the memories of that terrifying week. To this day, he has absolutely no explanation for what happened to him. He doesn't know who was recording him, how they got his new phone number, or why they targeted him in the first place. He doesn't know if it was a coworker, a jealous competitor, a client, or just a random psychopath who enjoyed watching someone slide into madness. The lack of answers is a heavy burden that he still carries. He lives in constant fear that one day his phone will ring and he will hear his own voice on the other end of the line once again. It is a reminder that we are never truly in control, and that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we can't see, the ones who watch us from the shadows of our everyday lives. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.